Good morning, everyone. So it's a great pleasure to be here today to present this symposium about TMS-EEG, which has emerged as a very important tool in order to characterize the electrophysiological dynamics underlying cognitive function. So, so far, many different methodological approaches have been used, and so that's why Professor Paolo Berardinelli and Dr. Arianna Brancaccio from the University of Trento will compare different TMS-EEG cleaning pipelines, and in particular, they are going to highlight the advantages and challenges for each methods. And then Professor Alberto Pisoni from University of Milano Bicocca will tell us something about effective and functional connectivity analysis of TMS-EEG data, since this technique allows to assess the cortical excitability not only of the simulated site but also of connected areas. And last but not least, Professor Silvia Casarotto from the University of Milano will talk about real-time monitoring of TMS low potential, and this specific toolbox has been designed to improve data quality, which is something we are really interested in. So enjoy it, and we are super proud of the very high-level speaker we have today, and the stage is yours. So the first one is Professor Paolo Berardinelli.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here on this rainy morning. I have a question for you. How many of you have given a single TMS pulse? So, quite some. Okay, so I think you can share some of my thoughts and my concerns. I remember attending to an MEG conference some years ago. I think Annalisa was there as well, and I remember a skeptical speaker talking about EEG and MEG and saying, okay, EEG and MEG is like being on the moon, looking at the Earth and trying to infer about human activity just looking at the lights which are on. Which has, the statement has some truth, but still EEG, MEG, and TMS-EEG is possibly the best way, one of the best ways we have to infer about human function non-invasively. And our main question, at least the main question of my talk and Arianna's talk, is that it's extremely difficult to establish some ground truth, because for some years, for MEG and EEG, the ground truth was intracranial EEG, recorded signals instead of reconstructed ones through an inverse solution. But still, invasive EEG is available only in patients and animals. It's a limited grid on some space, and for humans, it's available only in patients. Therefore, if you insert to the EEG measurement a TMS pulse, to some extent you add one dimension and possibly one new dimension of confounds. So what you really want to find in EEG following TMS, it's some kind of genuine reaction of the cortex to the TMS stimulus. And what we believe to be genuine reactions are some evoked potentials right after the stimulus, which last for some hundreds of milliseconds. Then directly from these evoked signals, you can Fourier transform and obtain some kind of spectrogram. In the last, say, 8 years, 6-8 years, there has been a raging debate about the genuinity of these evoked potentials. And I think we can discuss here because there are still some open issues, despite of the fact that we have sufficient evidence that at least until 100 milliseconds after the TMS pulse, we are talking about genuine responses of the cortical of the cortical activity to the TMS pulse. And even for later potentials, but this is my personal point of view, we can amend through suitable pipelines. So why to do TMS EEG? Because not only it adds a dimension of confounds, but it adds one dimension of information as well. So you can assess how the TMS pulse affects brain states and dynamics, and there is a growing body of literature showing how entire functional networks are clearly affected from one local TMS pulse. You can assess causal cortico-cortical interactions within a scale of milliseconds, and this is again something quite challenging to face when dealing with EEG alone. So of course you can infer causality, but the algorithms are relatively unstable. You can quantify and characterize the spread of activation, which follows in time, spatial and frequency domains. Of course, for all of this, everything you have learned about modeling in EEG can be used for this environment as well. And you can simulate both motor and non-motor areas. For decades, the TMS was used mainly on the motor area because you have a very simple and readable outcome, which is the motor evoked potential. So there is an enormous amount of works showing the effects of stimulating the hand knob of healthy patients and measuring the peak-to-peak amplitude of the MEP. And this has been always an easy to read outcome of the TMS effects. Actually, I've seen a good amount of subjects with multiple volleys in the MEP, in the MEP response. So I still wonder whether the peak-to-peak measure can be considered an exhaustive readout of the motor excitability. But this is again a topic for discussion. The evoked potentials we normally find when signals are clean, and these are not the cleanest signals possible, but we were super naive at the time, can be considered a measure of cortical reactivity. For instance, we have in our work in Tübingen, we have accumulated evidence that N45 can be a relatively reliable readout for the excitation inhibition balance. So this N45 potentials gets larger and smaller given the GABAergic or glutamatergic drugs the subjects assume, and the potential moves always in the right direction. So we believe N45 is a good readout for the excitation inhibition balance of the cortex, and we all know how many diseases are caused by the imbalance of this ratio. So basically, changes in TEP amplitudes can reflect changes in cortical activity of the stimulated region, but also in the contralateral hemisphere. And generally, it's a relatively robust readout, and you can reproduce TEPs at distance of days, weeks. And the procedure is relatively portable and relatively short. So basically, TMS EEG allows a direct evaluation of cortical excitability in time domain, but also you can measure non-phase locked reactions of the brain by subtracting the average evoked response from the signal, from the single trials, and then measure the induced response. There are some caveats to this method. I think even on the field trip webpage, they recommend to check that an acceptable consistency of the average evoked response is necessary in order to use effectively this approach, because if the latency changes from trial to trial, you risk to add more confound than what you subtract by subtracting the average evoked response. So in some cases, the analysis in the frequency domain is just for the entire signal, for the A signal. But in the case of, at least in the case of GABAergic drugs, where the signals were natively very clear and very good, we were able to subtract the evoked response and just analyze the induced variation in the signals. So this is another possible metric for the analysis of TMS EEG. Actually, what you already know is that a lot of the EEG signal is noise, and more so for the TMS EEG. So on one hand, you have brain signal with a high temporal resolution, and a response which comes from the whole of the cortex, which you cannot obtain by means of intracranial EEG. So you can analyze network dynamics. On the other hand, you normally live with the signal, which is affected by eye movement, blinks, muscle activity, changes in skin potentials, heartbeat, and the noise brought by the power line. Some of these artifacts are easily addressable. Some are less, and I think we can discuss about the effectiveness of this artifact removal techniques. For some years, ICA was considered a super effective tool. Nowadays, evidence is emerging that inherently some part of the signal is contained even in clearly artifactual ICA components. And here we come to the TMS EEG signal, which has for sure a brain signal, but it has also the artifacts due to the EEG measurement, plus TMS pulse artifact, decay artifacts, additional muscle contraction artifacts, and sometimes the capacitor recharge artifacts. And I think this is nicely shown by this figure of my colleague and friend Nigel Rogesh. This is just to let you know how and how much we have to deal with these artifacts. On one hand, there is an almost unique chance to evaluate the cortical response on the basis of milliseconds right after the TMS stimulus. On the other hand, we have to be reasonably sure that what we are measuring is cortical reaction and not some kind of TMS artifact related to the pulse or to some kind of reafference from the sensory periphery. And this is another example. We are showing here is shown on different amplitude and time scales the different artifacts due to TMS evoked muscle or the electrical and movement artifact, and how in C it is shown how the ICA components are normally modeled in the ICA algorithms. Actually, we have a work in progress with the Finnish group of Risto and Moniemi, showing that ICA is rather effective when the variability of components is sufficiently detectable. If the component is trial by trial, always the same, ICA has some issues. So basically, so I would not take the extreme position of some Finnish researchers who think that it's better to do without ICA, but one should be always conscious of the risks connected to ICA. And I think we need some kind of consensus, because I see the composition and recomposition is a rather powerful tool which can eliminate some artifacts, but can insert confounds as well. So basically, when dealing with the artifacts, we have two possible fronts, and I think we have to fight on both. So on one hand, in the lab, you should avoid at all costs the artifacts at the source and maximize transcranial evoked potentials. But I'm sure this will be super effectively shown by Silvia. So basically, you can do an effective check of the taps during your experiment to be sure that everything is going fine. And this simplifies, of course, the assumptions about taps, makes analysis much easier because you're eliminating some confounds, at least at the source. And one thing which was proposed by the Finns, by Finnish researchers who are very practical people, is to limit the stimulation areas to rather central areas of the cortex, trying to avoid the extremal part of the EEG cap in order to limit the artifacts due to the muscle reactions. On the other front, you can consider to stimulate wherever and then remove offline the artifacts. Of course, the two fronts are not mutually exclusive. Yes. So this is more difficult because you're keeping the artifacts and trying to remove at software level. It requires extremely specialized analysis and methods and pipelines, and Arianna will talk about this and about different pipelines and their effects, and allows the simulation of basically every cortical area covered by EEG sensors. Okay, a brief overview about the recording artifacts. We have the TMS pulse artifacts. Some historically, some prevention tools were the sample and hold circuit, trying to record the artifact without saturating the amplifier, and minimization of filters, and so on. And again, this interesting plot of Nigel was showing differences in TMS pulse artifacts due not only to the different stimulator, but also to the different kind of pulse, whether monophasic or biphasic. And what we are doing mostly nowadays is removing offline the TMS artifacts, which is basically non-amendable. So what you do is to remove data and then interpolate missing data to create possibly a smooth transition between prior and after the TMS artifact. There are some caveats and some things to be aware of. So basically, if you don't use a cubic spline and you interpolate in a rough way, some ringing artifacts can be detected due to the filtering. the TMS evoked decay artifacts is preventable in the lab by accurately preparing the electrodes in order to have a very low impedance, and possibly to ensure optimal lead with wire arrangement. It has been told that having all the wires radially to the ring electrode is a good practice. Otherwise, this is again some kind of artifact which is eliminated by ICA. The capacitor recharge artifact again it's simulator dependent, and you can either delay the capacitor recharge out of the TEPS area or offline remove the data in the interpolate or using the ICA. The muscle activity changes its topography depending on the area you're stimulating, and unfortunately it's quite subject dependent, as you can see in B and C. So Tuomas Mutanen in this paper of some years ago was showing some kind of traffic light plot about the safe electrodes on which to stimulate, and he was showing that the extremal electrodes, EEG electrodes at the sides of the head are the ones most affected by the muscle artifact. And again, you can use a plethora of algorithms, ICA, PCA, and now more effectively SSSP, Sears, and filters, or even modeling and subtracting, possibly at source level. Then there are the auditory evoked potentials, still in the last years. Some researchers were claiming that despite noise masking, and the N100 potential was inherently affected by some both by auditory potentials and some sensory reference. Again, my personal take, I don't think N100 is just artifact, it's not, but still the latency imposes us particular care in the evaluation of this artifact. Again, there are some lab practices to deal with this artifact, and you can record a sham TMS EEG session and subtract the sham from the real TMS EEG. Then there are the so to say easy artifacts like TMS evoked blinks. Again, my personal take from the lab, this is a typical eye blink topology and something you can remove with ICA with relative ease. So generally, it's a very it's a quite isolated component which does not bring with itself a part of genuine signal. And basically, I think I can go quickly through this part. I think more or less all of you have an idea of how ICA works. There is a mixed matrix, and you obtain the components, and you can in the end, we made a massive use of ICA. Until some years ago, we had 2 rounds of ICA, one just to remove the TMS artifact component, and then another round to remove what to remove. This is highly subjective. At best, with ICA, you remove just blinks and eye movements, because these are the ones who are 95% independent from brain activity, and they have very clear topologies. So these are extremely clear in most of the subjects. But even so, is saccades completely independent from brain activity? Probably not. So the extreme approach of some Finnish researcher is to get rid of ICA totally. This is just a spoiler of something which is going to come. So there are different GUIs, different interfaces for judging about ICA. My personal take is to be extremely cautious with anything else which is not eye blinks and saccades. And then more recently, again, the group from the Aalto University came with what is now possibly our elective algorithm to remove noise from TMS EEG data, which is the sound algorithm. And Arianna will talk more about the effects. It's basically a rough, extremely rough source estimate of EEG recordings from all the channels -1. So you're discarding one channel and use all the others to estimate the noise of that one channel. So it basically leverages the EEG data multidimensionality to clean the signals one by one using the sources. It's a very rough source estimation of the signal. For some reason, it's not really affected by the accuracy of the forward model, which is key normally for MEG and even more for EEG. So they're using mostly a spherical forward model, but it's quite effectively to clean the signals. So there are 2 conceptual steps: noise estimation of each sensor by means of the remaining signals, and cleaning of the whole EEG dataset according to the noise estimates. So basically, if you're relatively familiar with the algebra of forward and inverse problems, Y is your measured signals, and you assume that it's a clean signal plus noise, and clean signals is basically the transfer matrix, the lead field times your current density plus noise. So you want to get rid of the N. And this is what they do. They what we do, given that we are using their pipeline by means of minimum norm estimate. You eliminate one noisy channel. You do the source estimate with the others. You got a noise estimate of the signal, which you then subtract and go on with the recursive algorithm. And the effects are very nice. You see in red the signal pre-sound, in black the signal cleaned by sound. And in this proof of concept by Tuomas Mutanen, it's shown how sound is quite near to the estimated topology, with sound is quite near to the true topology, despite of extremely noisy signals. So this is all for my part. I think the interesting part will be told by Arianna now.
Hi. Okay, so thank you, Paolo. So Paolo gave a nice introduction on the different TMS-related artifacts that we find in the EEG signal. So now I'm presenting a project in which we try to understand if we can find a TMS EEG data preprocessing pipeline that is best among the available ones, which is not an easy task. And why do we do this? So in general, in TMS EEG literature, we have variability in the results, and we have different sources for this variability. So we have in the so-called inter-subject variability, and for example, it has been found that some TMS EEG metrics, like the TP's latencies, depend on the individual structural properties of the brain. So for example, TP's latencies correlate with DTI metrics, but also we have intra-subject variability. So for example, the cortical excitability of the brain at the moment of stimulation affects the result of the TMS stimulation. But also there is another source of variability, which is, I would say, more often overlooked, which is the so-called preprocessing dependent variability. So what it has been found is that exactly depending on the preprocessing pipeline that you use to preprocess your TMS EEG data, you will change the results. And this is a figure from a paper published by our colleagues in 2021. And what they did was exactly to preprocess the same TMS EEG dataset, in which the stimulation was given on the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. In this case, they preprocessed the same signal with 4 different preprocessing pipelines, which are RTs, TMS EEG, TIS, and sound. And what they found is exactly that the TP's amplitudes and topographies as well changed depending on the preprocessing pipeline employed. So what does this mean? It means that every time different research groups use different preprocessing pipelines to deal with the TMS-related noise, they are going to add new variability in the TMS EEG literature. So our idea is if we manage to find a preprocessing pipeline that cleans the data better, then we can also aim to define a standard and therefore reduce this preprocessing dependent variability. So here, how do we do this? So we are now interested in testing 3 different pipelines, which are RTs, TIS, and sound, as here. And we need some ingredients, right, to test which can be the best preprocessing pipeline among these 3. So we need a ground truth signal, a known ground truth, an evoked neural signal which does not contain the TMS-related noise. And we want to combine this known neural signal with a signal carrying only artifactual information, so only TMS-related signal. And in order to generate a test signal, which will be preprocessed with the 3 preprocessing pipelines, and at the end, each preprocessed signal will be compared again with the ground truth. And the preprocessed signal that will be as more similar, let's say, to the ground truth will have been, let's say, preprocessed by the best preprocessing pipeline. So let's take a look at the ground truth. So we chose to use non-simulated data. We used in particular sensory evoked potentials because these are real evoked potentials, but without TMS. So you don't have the TMS related artifacts in this data. So we have one subject data, so obtained through the median nerve stimulation of the left hand. We have 500 pulses in this data, which were given at 200% of individual perceptual threshold. And concurrently, EEG was acquired, of course, from 30 channels. So these are on the left, our sensory evoked potentials averaged across trials, but maybe we can see the classic components better in the averaged across electrodes. Of course, these are rectified signals, and this is our ground truth. Then we need the TMS-related artifactual signal, so signal carrying only TMS artifacts. And we obtained this using an ICA-based approach. So what we did was basically to take TMS EEG recordings from 4 different subjects, for which stimulation was given on the left motor cortex at 110% of the resting motor threshold. Here, for these data sets, the recording was acquired from 130 EEG channels. But before concatenating basically this data, we of course cleaned each subject's data set from the bed epochs. We interpolated the bed channels, and we interpolated also the signal between -2 and 5 milliseconds. So basically the signal around the pulse in order for the ICA decomposition not to be dominated by the big amplitude initial artifact due to the TMS. So we fed these concatenated datasets into a fast ICA algorithm. We obtained 30 components plus their mixing matrix, and now we could select 6 components that looked pretty artifactual. These are the waveforms of the components. I'm not sure you can distinguish them very well, but here, like what we found are typical muscular artifacts. We are going to see the topographies in a second, so it will be more clear from here. We can see that all the components carry the later part of the big amplitude artifact due to TMS. Here we have some decay, and we also decided these are blinks to keep in the artifactual signal also the ocular movements, given that we, the preprocessing pipeline also have to deal with ocular artifacts. These are the topographies, so these are pretty focal, as it is expected from TMS-related artifacts. And the 9th component is indeed the blinks that we decided to keep in our artifactual signal. So now we have to overlap the ground truth with the artifactual signal. How do we do this? Pretty simple, actually. So we take the weights of the 6 components chosen, we multiply them by their mixing matrix, we obtain basically the artifactual signal in sensor space, and now we can select the signal from the 30 channels that are also present in the sensory evoked potential, so in our ground truth, in order to combine the 2 signals. Before combining them, however, we had to do some tunings. So first of all, we decided to introduce in our artifactual signal the ocular artifacts, but we don't want the ground truth to contain the ocular artifacts, because in the end, the preprocessed signal will not contain, hopefully, the ocular artifacts. So when we compare the preprocessed signal with the ground truth, we don't want ocular artifacts to be in the ground truth. And so we first ran an ICA on the sensory evoked potential, so on the ground truth, and we just took out the ocular artifacts. Then we flipped the sensory evoked potential signal channels. Why? Because our stimulation in the artifactual signal, the TMS stimulation, was given on the left side, but our sensory evoked potentials were originally evoked with stimulation of the left hand. So we had the maximum effect of the sensory evoked potentials originally on the right side. By flipping now, we have both the ground truth signal of interest and the most of the artifacts to be on the same side. But then we had to correct for an offset between the 2 signals baselines. So we have the artifactual signal in blue and the sensory evoked potential baseline in orange. And as you can see, there is a pretty big offset between the 2 signals. So in order to make the 2 signals homogeneous, we did a trial-by-trial baseline correction. And now we see that the baselines are more comparable, and so the 2 data can be merged. Last but not least, we looked at the amplitude of our sensory evoked potentials. Their amplitude is pretty small compared to standard and classic TMS evoked potentials. And so what we did was to multiply them by a constant, by 2, in order to increase a little bit their amplitude and make them more comparable with TMS evoked activity. So now we have our ground truth, we have the artifactual signal, and we can create our test signal by summing them up. And this is exactly the signal that will be preprocessed with the 3 pipelines that we're testing. So let's take a look at the 3 pipelines. So these are the parameters, the common parameters that we used across pipelines. So we have the epoch length from minus 100 to 200 milliseconds, the baseline interval, interpolation interval, and the classic low pass and high pass filters and notch filters. So the three pipelines were run in accordance, let's say, with the suggested preprocessing steps from each reference publication. ARTIST and TISA, I would say they are more similar to each other than they are to Sound SSPSIR. ARTIST and TISA are in fact said to be ICA-based preprocessing pipelines. They both use ICA basically to decompose the signal and take out artifactual components. ARTIST is fully automatic. It's said to be user independent, so the user doesn't have to decide a thing. So nor the bad trials, nor the bad channels, nor even the bad components carrying the artifacts. TISA is a little bit different in the sense that the user can also choose whether to keep or not the components that are selected as bad by the TISA algorithm. Sound is completely different in the sense that it does not rely on ICA unless for ocular artifacts. So the only time that the Sound SSPSIR pipeline uses ICA is to detect blinks or eye movements. But for the rest, it is based on the Sound and SSPSIR algorithms. So Sound, which is, like Paolo also said, an algorithm that deals with noise in the recordings. It can be used with TMS EEG data, but also with MEG, EEG data. And also on the SSPSIR algorithm, which is in this case used to deal with the TMS-related muscle artifact. Let's take a look at the results. So this is the to be reconstructed signal, our ground truth, and we try to see how good each preprocessed signal is with respect to our ground truth. And these are the three preprocessed signals. So the ARTIST preprocessed signal, TISA, and Sound. From here, of course, we cannot say already which pipeline is best. But I mean, we can see that the waveform are pretty well respected in the preprocessed signal compared to the ground truth signal. Let's take a look at this in a more detail. So here we're looking at each panel. Shows in blue the preprocessed signal. So for example, this is ARTIST against the sensory evoked potentials ground truth. And as we can see, so ARTIST creates this initial component that is not really present in the original ground truth data. It exaggerates this second component here with respect to the ground truth data in orange. It follows pretty well this third component here, but it basically ignores this latter component, and as it does not even show the deflection that is present in the ground truth signal. TISA does a bit better in the sense that it still creates this initial component here that, I mean, is not really present in the ground truth data. It also exaggerates this second component here, but later on it seems to follow the ground truth signal a bit better, in the sense that here we can still find some of the deflection that is present in the ground truth signal. As for Sound, it does much better in the beginning, so it does not create this initial component that is not present in the ground truth signal. It does not exaggerate this component here. Actually, it undermines it a little bit, but it follows the signal here very well. It finds this deflection, even though it looks like it delays this last component compared to the ground truth signal. So here we're looking at these results with a qualitative approach, let's say. So let's look at it in a more quantitative approach. So let's correlate the signal, the preprocessed signal, with the ground truth. So how did we do this? First, we created a ground truth signal ad hoc for each preprocessed signal. Basically, what we did was to take out from the ground truth the trials that were discarded as bad by each preprocessing pipeline, so that now we are sure that we are comparing each preprocessed signal trial with its corresponding trial in the ground truth. Then we made the ground truth comparable, so we baseline corrected, downsampled, filtered the same as the preprocessed signal, and then we applied a Spearman classic correlation between the each channel of the preprocessed signal and its corresponding channel of the ground truth signal. And the correlation was run between 5 and 200 milliseconds, and then we looked into absolute values because we're not really interested in the direction of the correlation here, but more in the strength of the correlation between the two signals. So this is the ARTIST. So here we see the cross correlation shown on the topo plot. Here we see the cross correlation values between the preprocessed and the ground truth signal. So ARTIS does not really do so bad, and especially we see that the highest correlation values are present in the channels at which we expect the signal to be strongest. So the sensory evoked potential should be strongest around T3, CP3. So it doesn't do that bad. We see that there are 8 channels showing pretty high correlation values between the preprocessed and the ground truth signal, but we see that there are as many as other channels showing pretty low correlation values. So ARTIS, okay, it's not like the best, but like at least in the areas at which we expect the sensory evoked potentials, it doesn't do that bad. TISA does a bit better. We see that there are like more channels showing high correlation values. It does not only show high correlation values only in the regions at which we expect the effect to be strongest, but also at other channels. But we also see that there are pretty some channels showing pretty low correlation values between the preprocessed and the ground truth signal. This is sound instead. So sound shows more channels compared to the other 2 preprocessed signals who have the highest correlation between the preprocessed and the ground truth signal. In general, I would say that the cross correlation values between the preprocessed signal with sound and the ground truth are almost skewed toward 1. So this is comforting in a way. But here I must add something. So our method to extract the artifactual signal is ICA based. And this means that we might be actually favoring in a way the ICA based pipelines. So TISA and sound, because it's TISA and ARTIS, because we're feeding them an artifactual signal that was already decomposed before. So in a way, we think that TISA and ARTIS might even behave worse with real TMS EEG data, while sound here should not be favored. So there is not a bias towards sound. So we are safer at saying that sound might be the best preprocessing pipeline here. So to conclude, both TISA and sound perform fairly well TMS EEG data preprocessing. However, like I just said, our artifactual components extraction method is ICA based, so we might be favoring TISA and ARTIS. But despite this, sound still returns the cross correlation values between the preprocessed and the ground truth. These are the values that are mostly skewed toward 1. And so, because of point 2 and 3, we suggest that sound might become the new standard in TMS EEG data preprocessing. So I want to thank you for your attention, and I want to thank the colleagues who have participated to this project. And yes, so I think we're done.
We talked about visually masking of pulse click. Do you think this step is so important also when we contrast to identical conditions in terms of TMS click or not?
This is subtle and to some extent debatable. There are different takes. The extreme one is like is almost always necessary, and I have my personal take when you're stimulating exactly the same area and you're contrasting the 2 conditions. Less the one condition affects the auditory network.
That seems
Sound to subtract.
Because usually in our lab we contrast different trials which are different just for the awareness level of the presented stimulus. So basically, the stimulation intensity is exactly the same. The stimulation side is exactly the same. The only things that is different is the awareness of the stimulus. So I think that it's something we should try to mask as much as possible. But then, from a statistical point of view, I feel that since we are contrasting the same, exactly the same, let's say, sound artifact.
And which is your approach, your technical masking that we
usually we use white noise.
Okay. Okay. It's a matter of taste, but some researchers would tell you that still, even with high level of white noise, which has some other effects, some subjects can hear the click, and if the attention levels are different,
I also think that people
plus,
feel.
So if I'm a simple and rough guy, so I'm working mostly with the motor network.
Okay.
But this is rather subtle because the different levels of awareness could imply different states of readiness of the auditory network.
Even if the stimuli we are considering are visual.
Okay. Again, it's a never-ending debate.
Yeah.
So there are cross-modal effects.
Okay.
To me, so if I get your review, your paper as a reviewer, for me it's fine. For other people, it's not.
Okay, and which is the method you suggest?
I'm very happy with the artificial click generation of the iron tooth. Click is the name of the tooth. Tak. because there you're not using white noise. You're really making the click. So in a notion of clicks, you cannot recognize the real click.
Thank you.
Well, the idea of just to look at the idea of this software that replaces white noise with a sort of color noise, which is a mixture of white noise plus coin click of your simulator with scrambled phases. The idea is that you can play with parameters. So if you have a collaborative subject, you can ask, do you still hear the click? Yes. You hear high pitch or low pitch? Well, high pitch. So maybe we should modify the noise to click ratio in the audio file explained. So we have more parameters to play with to mask the click, more than just the loudness. Should mask better without increasing too much loudness, which can be important.
This is important because we detected some effects of high white noise on even on MEPs. But to be able to leverage different parameters in order not to get the volume too high, I think.
I have a question about the sound line and algorithm, and it's how much space is left for the experimenter to choose parameters compared to the ICA-based pipelines, because I feel that one of the weak spots of we work mainly with a let's say DESA-inspired pipeline, even if it's not identical, but it's quite similar. I feel that one of the weak spots of ICA-based pipelines, especially it's the ICA part, meaning that it's left if you're not, especially if you're performing like a manual rejection of the components. But even if you're like doing it in an automatic way, I think it's much left to the experimenter to the parameters that he chooses, or like in the case of manual rejection, to the components that he decides or she decides to keep or to keep in the data. So is the sound pipeline any different from this point?
So you can choose here. So for this project, we decided to run the sound SSPR manually. So we did bed trials rejection, bed channels interpolation, also the SFCR components carrying the TMS muscular artifacts were selected by the user. So here we didn't leave it to the software, but you can also automatize it. So, and even though in general, I would say that I know we all have a problem with the fact that the pipelines shouldn't be user dependent, because of course there is some variability introduced by us, but we will not. It's hard to find an automatic way that is as good as an expert, let's say, in finding the artifacts. So even the bed trials, for example. So if we're thinking of the easiest thing, so finding the muscular and bed trials, I saw that there were some discrepancies between TISA and ARTIS, which were doing this in an automatic way, and the ones that I discarded as bad. And they would leave in the signal many more bad trials that I would discard. So the fact that sound SSPR is better might depend also on the fact that here there is an expert eye looking at the different aspects of the artifacts. Maybe you're right. Maybe we should also run sound SSPR completely automatically, so that we can say if it is safe also to say that sound is best, even if run in a completely automatized way for maybe less expert users. So.
So sound is based also on the Swiss reconstruction method. So did you try different and is the impact also this choice?
No, I mean, it is based on a minimum norm estimate. So yeah, you don't choose that.
Okay.
And we use the standard head model and lead field. We didn't use the individual information.
It's not really important.
No, but I mean, you can choose that.
Also, what is the impact on the number of EEG electrodes?
On the sound, you mean?
Yeah.
So the more the electrodes, the better the sound algorithm. That should be for sure, because like every time especially for sound, because every time it estimates the noise levels of each channel, it does so by using all the other channels. So of course it is advantaged if you have the more electrodes you have, the better estimate you have. And here we see that it works very well even with so few channels. So 30 channels is not that much if you think about it. We usually do experiments with 64 channels on average. And here though, like it still does very well. So yeah, thank you.
The topographies of the correlation between the real and the purposes data that you showed. Is there a reason why there was that spot on
here?
Yeah. So the stimulation was delivered there, or it was more frontal?
TMS stimulation was around C3, FC1, because it was on the motor cortex, on the left motor cortex for the 4 participants. I think that is an electrical artifact that the 3 pipelines haven't basically dealt with.
If it was related to the types.
Yes, it is mainly it is only on the side of the stimulation. I think that's an electrical artifact that the 3 pipelines haven't really resolved. So yeah.
Space for improvement. How to reach
I'm not an expert. Like I'm an expert user, but I'm not an expert in developing pipelines. I don't know. So what I noticed is that ARTIS and TISA, for example, because also TISA it is not a bad pipeline, right? Here, though, we do not know how well it is doing because of our ICA-based artifactual data generation. But it's not in general that bad. What I noticed though is that, for example, the initial component that both artist and TISA create, but that it is not contained in the ground truth data, that it could be due maybe to the downsampling that both pipelines do very early. So that even they don't even take out the artifacts that they already do downsampling and basically apply anti-aliasing filters. And this could be some issue. So I think that there is a lot of improvement one can make in artist and TISA pipelines, maybe more than Sound and Sphere, which already does pretty well. But of course, like, one needs to play a lot with the two pipelines before saying anything for sure, let's say. But yeah.
Make some changes.
No, I did the downsampling. I moved the downsampling from the beginning to the last. I changed it to be the last step rather than one of the first, like Sound does. For example, the Sound SSP pipeline does the downsampling as one of the last steps. And at least with the artist pipeline, the amplitude of this first component decreased. So it made me think that it could be due, at least for some portion of that component might come anti-aliasing filter applied through downsampling. So that's why I'm saying, but one has to play a lot in changing the pipelines in order to see which step has the major effects on the clean signal.
For example, in practice pipeline, there is the first step is like interpolation of the pass artifact, but you already remove the pass artifact from the TMS data, right? Your artifacts were other than the pass. Right?
So I kept, because if you look at the components, yes, I interpolated it because I didn't want the whole signal to be flattened, basically, because there would be only the big amplitude, the initial artifact. But in the components extracted in the waveforms, you can still see the latter part, the big amplitude artifact. So there is still some artifact. The idea was, let's interpolate it here before feeding it to the ICA, because it will be anyway interpolated by the three pipelines. So I kept the interpolation period to be the same for the artifactual data that were fed to the ICA, and for the signal to be preprocessed in the three different pipelines. It's a good question. What do they have in Tübingen? Because I used some data. Max? Mac Pro. The neuro one. Was neuro one?
I think the neuro one with the subset.
It was the neuro one, yes. Yeah.
They record 128 channels as a standard, but I think for this particular measurement, they only use the subset.
No, here they did 130 channels for 800 pulses per participant. So long.
Sure. So do you think sound is effective also when stimulating peripheral electrodes, or?
So we have no personal experience.
Okay. Yeah.
The things are quite. So coming from MEG, what I find totally non-intuitive is the claim that the accuracy of the forward model does not really affect the sound performance. But seems this way.
We will try.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
So the next speaker is Professor Alberto Pisoni.
Ci ho dato il nome. Sì, sì. Great. Okay. So, good morning, and thank you to the organizer for inviting me here today. And I will present some works that we are doing some years in our lab, in our TMS EEG lab, addressing the issue of effective and functional connectivity in TMS EEG data. And I'm glad that Professor Blardinelli and they showed the techniques, so with all the pitfalls and or the problems that we have while acquiring the data, because we will also look how these may affect, or the handling of these effects affect these matrices. First, before jumping into the hot topic, I just wanted to spend a few words talking about what we mean by effective and functional connectivity. You may be also already acquainted with these terms, but let's just have a starting ground. So the idea of connectivity measures stem from the debate that started around the early 90s of adding to the functional segregation that cognitive neuroscience was taking as a main framework to work with. So just looking at how different regions may exert some, or may be involved in different cognitive tasks or subtasks, with the idea that there should be also some integration of information between or across different regions to process or to allow these processes. And so in this sense, it was proposed not to just look at how single regions worked to perform at or during the performance of a task, but also to see how these regions interact between them to render this possible. And usually connectivity measures are split into two different groups, so the functional connectivity measures and the effective connectivity measures. And usually by functional connectivity is consider any metric that can assess a statistical dependency between two different distant or non-distant neurophysiological events. So it's just a description of pattern of neural activity that can be acquired by using different methods that we will see some of these afterwards. And actually the aim of functional connectivity is establishing how regions or two signals share some mutual information. So how these two different sources of brain signal that can come from electrophysiological recordings, but also metabolic methods like PET or fMRI, has some information that is shared by these two or more sources. Conversely, effective connectivity measures usually have a different aim, so to infer a causal relationship between different sources of brain activity. And largely these measures are model dependent and are supposed to be a combination between the functional aspect of brain activity and also the structural aspect of brain activity. So how regions are actually connected, or region and neurons are actually connected one with each other. And as a way to measure the effective connectivity, there have been proposed different methods that are mainly based on two different aspects of the induction of the signal or the generation of the brain signal, which is the temporal precedence of, or the temporal relationship between the two sources of activity, and the application of a perturbation approach, which usually is considered as perturbational approach also the sensory stimulation of the subject, so inducing some ERPs due to the presentation of sensory visual, auditory, somatosensory stimuli to the subject. But of course, in this perturbation approach, TMS EEG has stepped in as it has been developed. So the perturbation in this sense is not anymore a peripheral stimulation that passes through the sensory systems, but it is central, meaning that we are stimulating by an external source the cortex. And so we come to the TMS EEG part. So TMS EEG has been already introduced, so I will go very fast on this part. So it is the recording of the TMS or of the EEG signal while delivering TMS pulses. The outcome of this procedure is the recording or the computation of TMS evoked potentials, which are as ERPs, but starting from the TMS stimulation and not by the presentation of an sensory stimulus. And here is one of the first work that systematized or tried to describe in a systematic way the components that stem from the stimulation from TMS stimulation and EEG co-recording. The result is a series of deflections, which are components which have been linked to some neurophysiological properties, as Professor Belardinelli was showing before, in a systematic way. So TMS EEG allows probing cortical excitability, and as was pointed out before, outside the classic regions that were stimulated by TMS, so M1 and V1 that has a direct readout, or at least M1 has, which is MEP, so motor evoked potential, and in some way also V1 with phosphines reporting by participants. And this is important because if you are familiar with TMS literature, it is mainly based on M1 stimulation, but of course then stepped out from the motor domain and has been applied cognitive neuroscience over pretty much all regions or cortical regions. And in clinical application, it is not M1, or it's not only M1, mostly in the psychiatric domain, that is addressed with TMS. So it is important to know how also other regions than M1, which also has some specific characteristics in terms of of neural population that are present inside it, that can of course influence the outcome of the TMS pulses. By stimulating a specific region and seeing how the signal spreads from the stimulated region to the rest of the cortex, we can establish a causal relationship between what we record at distant site, or of course also at the stimulation site, and where we are stimulating, because we know exactly where we are causing the initial perturbation or the initial activity in the cortex. And this has been proposed as a measure of effective connectivity. And indeed, the Massimini paper of 2005 was the first one of systematically claiming this, or at least showing how this could be translated in the in real recordings. And so effective connectivity in TMS EEG data is classically considered to be the analysis or the observation of how activity spreads from the stimulated regions to other cortical pulses. And in this way, cortico-cortical interaction are triggered by the TMS pulse. At the beginning was claimed without the involvement of the thalamic inputs. Of course, this not totally true, because there is always a cortico-thalamic interaction when we stimulate the cortex. However, for sure, we are not passing by the sensory thalamus, so not as classically it is involved in perturbing or eliciting a cortical activity. And going back to one of the foundations of effective connectivity, it has structural constraints. So there are experimental evidence that it is driven also by structural features of the stimulated brain, but also reflects functional modulation. So how the state of the stimulated cortex at the moment of the stimulation. And this is indeed the first, or one of the first evidence that we have, that is the paper by Massimilian and colleagues in 2005, where different level of consciousness in terms of wakefulness and deep sleep state evoke different patterns of TEPS profile, both on the description at the level of the number of deflection and the temporal presentation of them, but also how signals spread from the stimulated regions to very distant area of the brain, as we can see from this source reconstruction distribution of the activity. So we have a complex and distributed response. Whereas when this level or the wakefulness of the participants was not present anymore, so we have a deep sleep state stimulation of the same cortical hotspot, the number and the amplitude also of the TMS evoked potential changed, a component changed, and also the spatial distribution of the response was dramatically reduced. So the activity was just localized under the stimulator and did not spread across different regions. And this has been taken as a proof that communication, or the state of communication of the stimulated brain region, can affect how the signal spreads. TMS signal spreads through the cortex. And this has also been reproduced with other kind of modulation of the level of consciousness. So, for example, in anesthesia. And on the clinical point of view, it has been proposed that it can also be an indicator or a biomarker of different disorders, of different disorders of consciousness, meaning that the complexity in time and space of the TMS evoked response indicates the level of, can be associated with different disorders of consciousness, meaning that the more simple the response in time and space, the worse or the most severe clinical condition is present in the patient. And as I was mentioning before, the complexity and the spread of the signal from the stimulated regions to distant regions has been found to be correlated with structural connectivity assessed with DTI measures. What we did in our lab in the last years, trying to see how TMS-EEG could track effective connectivity, was to look at how the communication between regions and the activity of the different cortical regions change according to different neuromodulatory protocols. And in particular, we applied the different electrical non-invasive brain stimulation techniques and see how signal change before and after the TMS-EEG signal change before and after the application of these techniques, which are thought to induce changes in how the stimulated, in this case from the electrical point of view, regions should work. And so we tried it in different ways, as you can see here. Basically, the setting was always the same. In this sense, it's quite consistent, the evidence that we collected across the years. So we had the TMS-EEG setup with the concurrent application of electrical stimulation. So we had the TDSCS patch under one of the electrodes of the EEG cap, and the other one was on the forehead, so did not affect the EEG setup. And we recorded TMS-EEG before, also during, but then we discarded this information for some data sets because it's very noisy, and post electrical stimulation. And we tried with anodal stimulation that should increase cortical activity or some aspect of cortical activity, and cathodal, we should decrease it. And indeed, what we found was that activity, so the response to TMS the EEG response to TMS changed not only in the stimulated region, but also in, that was the parietal cortex, but also in distant regions in particular. As you can see here, that these are the data after the before, during, and after anodal stimulation in distant regions. And we did not find it during cathodal stimulation, so we have no changes in the TMS evoked activity after cathodal stimulation or sham stimulation, of course. So as I was mentioning before, the activity here we have before, during, and after the stimulation changed not only on the stimulated regions, which is here in the parietal cortex, but also in these frontal regions, also at distant time points after the TMS pulse, meaning that potentially the effective connectivity between the parietal cortex and the frontal regions increased, somehow was changed, to the application of the electrical protocol. As it seems by the analysis of different parcels, but also by the exploration of this time course of the spread of the activity, the changes that were induced by the electrical protocol are not limited to the stimulated site, but also to distant regions, but not all brain regions, but regions that potentially are functionally or structurally very connected with the ones that we stimulated. And here I just presented the image of the default mode network, because participants in this specific experiment were at rest. So potentially the default mode network is the one that is active during, or should be active during rest, whatever that means. So to see if exactly the effective connectivity was not changed in general, but was related to the state of participants during the stimulation, we decided to add a task during the application of the electrical protocol to see if generally just structural connected regions increase their communication with the stimulated, with the TMS stimulated region, or it was related to the application or to the activity of the of a specific functional network during the application of the electrical protocol that should change the effective connectivity of the stimulated region. So in this case we stimulated the BR6 and we asked participants to perform a language task, which was a verbal fluency task. What I wanted just to point out is that we found again an increase in communication or an increase in activity in the TMS hotspots that was where also electrical protocol, or near where electrical protocol was delivered, but also in connected regions, in particular the inferior frontal gyrus, that is one of the hubs that is active during the verbal fluency task. And we did not find any changes in communication or in connectivity, so in activity, in regions that were not involved in the functional networking that was active during task performance, in particular by stimulating the parietal cortex while activating the frontal network. We could not see any changes both in the core local activity or in the distributed activity after the TMS pulse. So that means that potentially these frontoparietal changes in effective connectivity that we found in the previous experiment at rest was driven by the state of the participants while stimulating. In this case, the frontoparietal network was not that active during the application of the electrical protocol, so the changes in connectivity or in communication between regions was limited to the set of regions that were involved in a functional linguistic network that we activated during the task. Just to try out this again, we applied the same parietal setting that we saw for the anodal and cathodal stimulation, and we ask participants to perform a task that involves these parietal regions, and in particular we applied some tasks that attentional orienting tasks. And indeed what we saw was at the behavioral level that participants with cathodal stimulation decreased their performance in the attentional shifting paradigm. And we also saw some changes in the communication between the parietal and frontal regions again. But in this case with cathodal TDCS that was not triggering any changes at rest. So by adding the activation of a functional network, we unveiled modulation driven by the electrical protocol, also with the cathodal polarity that was not effective at rest. So this adds evidence that potentially by applying a TMS pulse and recording EEG activity, we can track changes in the communication between regions by looking at how signal spreads from the stimulated regions to other regions. And this is linked to structural properties, but also to functional properties of the stimulated regions when we are applying the pulse. And this changed according to the history of neuromodulation that these regions have. Now we are shifting also to see how this change according to what participants are doing without any other electrophysiological neuromodulatory intervention. And so we perform TMS EEG recordings during a simple go-no-go task, in which participant has to perform a very simple task that is pressing a button, where when they see some targets, and they have to withhold the response when they see some other targets. And this particular paradigm is known to elicit what is called the readiness potential, which is a negative deflection that starts 1 second before the presentation of the targets and is maximal at the central sites. And it has been proposed to be a electrophysiological marker of the readiness to start a movement, and has a cortical sources, the SMA and the pre-SMA as a main generator. So what we did was to stimulate the pre-SMA during this task at different time points, building on the fact that as to see if this increase in activity that is related to the preparation of the motor act is also linked to different states of the SMA, so different functional states of the SMA as the action has to be performed. So the idea was that in an early time window, the SMA should be in some state, and in a late time window, it should be in another state if the increase in activity related to the readiness potential is linked to the performing of the motor act. And indeed is what we found. And here you have the activity from the different cortical sites, so the stimulated region, so the SMA, and the right inferior frontal gyrus, which is involved in the withhold of the response usually, and in the visual cortices, because these the stimuli that we were giving to so the targets were visual stimuli. And indeed, as the action approaches, SMA was more active, so had greater and different also components in after the TMS pulse as compared to the early time window, but also activity in distant parcels changed, meaning that it decreases the activity in the inferior frontal gyrus of the right hemisphere, potentially because participant had to perform potentially the action, so the inhibitory network was downregulated, and increased instead in the visual regions that had to acquire the signal to start the action. So this is about effective connectivity, which is one of the main way in which cortico-cortical interaction has been explored with TMS and EEG. So what about functional connectivity? So the first question should be why we have TMS EEG, which is a powerful tool, and it really adds a lot of information in understanding how cortico-cortical interaction develops over time when we stimulate a specific region, and also when participants are performing different tasks or the brain is modulated in different ways. So why trying to see if there is also some feature that is not causally started from the simulation side and spreads to other regions, but just see at how the activity spreads over the cortex. So one first reason could be that because functional connectivity patterns has been shown to be specific for sensory and motor processing. So, and of course, this also holds for cognitive processes. So just looking at how activity spreads through the cortex may be just a part of the information that we can get from this technique. But we can maybe get a little bit more into how the signal spreads through regions and see if there are also qualitative changes in this connection. So not just about the amount of signal that is picked up by these distant regions, but also how this signal is, of course, structured in the frequency domain. So before stepping into how this can, or how we try to implement this in a TMS setting, of course, there are some open questions on a theoretical side. So just, for example, looking at how, at which functional connectivity measure we can use to assess these qualitative changes in communication between regions after a TMS pulse. Indeed, functional connectivity measures are a lot, and it is like a forest of measure. Can be non-directed, directed, model-based, model-free, can be in the time, can be acquired in the time domain, but also in the frequency domain. And each of these measures has some properties that can suit better or worse to the cause. So, for example, it has been proposed that some functional connectivity measure linked to power estimates, so for example, the power envelope correlation, can be used to assess communication between regions, and also this can be also more linked to the reflection of the metabolic activity through different regions. However, in this case, since we are using a big chunk of activity with TMS, maybe it is better to look not at the power, but at the phase of the signal that we are acquiring. However, also phase functional connectivity measure have different properties. So the first one that had been proposed was coherency. So see the linear relationship actually between the power spectra of two signals. But of course, this is highly biased by volume conduction, and also the imaginary part of the coherency is somehow affected by completely in phase, at least at the 0 and 180 degrees correlation of signal activity. So we have other measures, for example, the ones that are not, that look at non-linear relationship between signals, and in particular, the ones that are looking at how phases of two signals are locked with each other. So, for example, the phase locking value, but maybe even better, the phase lag index and the weighted phase lag index can give us an index of how two sources are communicating one within each other. So the idea of these phase locked measures is that if two sources of activity are communicating between them, they should have some properties of the phases that are shared. And in this case, it's not the exact phase, but is a lag, so a difference in the phases of the two signals, because completely in phase signals potentially are stemming from the same source. So it discards 0 phases correlations and looks at how phases lag in a systematic way across trials with the PLV, but even better, how the distribution of the phase lag is positioned between the 0 lag and the medium or the mean of the lag between the signals and trials, which is the phase lag index. Again, the PLV is highly based by volume conduction, so what we use, or we try to use better, are measures that are reject the real part of the oscillatory component and just look at the imaginary parts, so the phase of the phase of the oscillation. And in particular, the weighted phase lag index, which weights more what is runs away from the real axis, but is more linked to phase properties, is maybe suited better for TMS-EEG measures, which are inducing a lot of power activity when the simulation occurs. Then there is the problem of ghost interactions, which is common to all methods that tries to estimate a correlation between, so not only TMS-EEG, but also EEG or MEG, maybe MEG a bit less, between two sources. So that means that starting from a single central connectivity between two different sources, the spread of the activity may affect not only local connectivity, but also distant connections. And this in the PLV is highly present. It is less present on the local connections when we look at the imaginary part of the imaginary PLV, but long distance relationships are always can also be always mixed with spurious correlation or spurious interactions. So there are some procedures that, or methods that can be applied to try to limit these ghost interactions. The first one is using functional connectivity measures which are not affected by linear signal mixing, as the WPLI. So here you see how the WPLI works with different levels of noise or of linear signal mixing that is added to the original sources. But of course, nonlinear mixing is affecting also the WPLI. Another approach or another procedure that can be applied, of course, is testing against the null hypothesis. So trying to see if the connectivity pattern that one has after the computation is random or not. And actually what we do is applying these against the null hypothesis, but also other labs do, but also compare it with surrogate data. So you create a surrogate data set by shuffling the phase and see how this fares against the real data to see what remains of statistically different from noise or to the null hypothesis. Of course, there are also some more complex approaches. So for example, the hyperedge bundling that looks at how signal noise distributes in the adjacency matrices and then tries to collapse those connections and thus minimizing the noise that there is across connectomes that can stem after the computation of the connectivity measures. The last question, of course, is related to the specific TMS and the EEG setting. So how does TMS interact with functional connectivity? And this is not, of course, a trivial question, because TMS interacts with oscillatory activity, so induces specific patterns of brain oscillations. And this is not only related to the specific regions, but also travels across regions. So this, for example, is a work by Rosanova's group that showed that stimulating different regions elicits a oscillatory pattern that is specific for each region, and it's potentially linked to the natural frequencies at which the regions resonate when stimulated with TMS at rest, and it's not affected by stimulation intensity, for example. And also here, this is an early work by the same group that tried to develop some metrics to see how signal spreads after TMS pulse. And here you have the phase lock of the signal that, as you can see, travels also to other regions than the stimulated one. In this case was the visual cortex. So there is at least a phase locking, phase resetting that follows the TMS pulse. And these, okay, I was going in a direction. And this, however, has to be explored in terms of its meaning that TMS oscillatory activity is just a phase reset due to the TMS pulse, or is added energy to the system and thus reflects also the state of activation of the regions that we are stimulating. Of course, it depends. So the question is, depends only on structural, but also on functional properties of the stimulated region. And this still was not answered in literature. Of course, after this theoretical question, there are also the practical ones that the previous talk addressed in a quite specific way. So how the procedures that we have to implement to acquire the TMS EEG signal can influence functional connectivity measures. And I just cite a few of them. There are more. There are procedures that are related to data acquisition. So, for example, how, if and how noise masking is performed, and how stimulation intensity is handled. So, how strong we are stimulating with the TMS. Another point that I would add here, I'm not addressing it, we wanted to do it, but we didn't have enough data, is the acquisition method to handle the TMS artifact. The data that I will present today have been acquired with a sample and hold system, so we don't have the TMS artifact per se, so we don't have these specific artifacts. We have some decay artifacts from the leakage of the pulse if the impedance is not optimal, but we don't have that. But of course, looking at how connectivity patterns change, if you remove the TMS artifact or you don't have it because you don't record it, it's quite impactful. There are procedures linked to data pre-processing, and please address this. So artifact removal procedures that can be based to source reconstruction or to ICA handling of these artifacts, how this affects functional connectivity is still to be seen. And of course, then in the connectivity computation, so which functional connectivity measure is adopted and how this fares in a TMS EEG context. So what I will do is I will present some data that we acquired in different conditions and see how these change the functional connectivity patterns with a sample and hold system. The first set of TMS procedures that we wanted to address were the ones in the acquisition part. So noise masking is a procedure that has to be performed to reduce the impact of the TMS click. If you have performed TMS simulation, you know that TMS, when discharged, produces a loud click, a loud sound, not so loud, but clearly audible sound. The problem here is that the sound is time locked with the also with the onset of the ERP or the TEP computation. So if you don't mask it out, part of the activity that you are recording and you are reporting in your data is linked to the auditory potential that, of course, are not the ones you are interested into if you want to look at how TMS is activating the cortex. So here, for example, you have two data acquired stimulating BA6 with noise masking and without noise masking. And you can see that there are some artifactual components in the late TEP's components, which are linked to the topography of the artifact, of the auditory artifact. And indeed, if we look at how functional connectivity changes, if we apply the noise masking or if we don't apply noise masking, you can see that at least in the alpha and beta frequencies, these are the 20% the 20% strongest connections from starting from BA6 to the other regions are linked to the temporoparietal regions, posterior regions that are the ones in which maybe generated the sound artifact. Conversely, if we mask the TMS click with the noise masking procedures, we unveil as strongest connections also connection with the frontal sides that are the ones that were also present in the topographies of the distribution of the activity. So, of course, we could imagine that it could have some impacts, but of course we have also some more evidence that it is genuinely important to mask this out if you want to see how the interaction, cortico-cortical interaction are developing after the TMS pulse. So going to simulation intensity, here the problem is much more complex potentially because we have so of course we can simulate a different intensity. The minimum, the bare minimum should be an intensity that can evoke some activity in the stimulated cortex, but also depends on which cortical sites we are stimulating. So for example, we know that if we stimulate the motor cortex above the resting motor threshold, there is also the influence of reafferent sensory information coming from the contraction of the muscle that is activated by the TMS pulse. So, and this has been shown in different papers, and is something that is affecting the signal at the late components, so around 300 milliseconds on the spectral features, but also on the early components in the time domain. Here you have an example of how the simulation of the right M1 with MEPs and without MEPs changes the activity of the REN, maybe due to the reafferent signal from the contraction of the muscle, and this also changed functional connectivity between regions. And the changes due to TMS intensity seems to be linked to specific frequency bands, in particular the alpha and beta frequencies, that here you have the components that affected the signal at different intensities, and indeed the component in the alpha and beta band is the one that was most sensitive to the changes in stimulation intensity of the motor region. What we saw at the functional connectivity level, indeed, of course, was that raising the stimulation intensity increased the connectivity pattern, and this can be linked also to the fact that we have a better signal-to-noise ratio, and so we have a better signal or a stronger signal to analyze. But here you can see, especially in the alpha band, that is more limited the set of connection with the parietal regions that may be affected with the sensory information. Going to the artifact removal procedures, we try to see how ICA, and so there are different procedures, but these have already been shown. So there are ICA procedures that can be used to handle artifacts, and in particular TMS artifact, but also muscular artifacts due to the stimulation or eye blinks, or source space projection and source informal reconstruction methods. And for example, sound and SSPC in particular are the ones that are most used to clean data going to the source space and then project them in the sensor space. And here we analyze the same M1 dataset with the ICA approach and the SSPC approach. as has been shown before. And we indeed actually found something very similar, because here the scale is different. I'm sorry, I should have put the same one. But indeed, the last component were a little bit, with the sound, or actually the SSPC procedure. But also, as you can see, the first component was greater with the ICA, as you found, and smaller with the sound. So it's pretty consistent with what you showed before. Actually, at the functional connectivity level, things are much less different than in the other comparisons that I showed. But again, for example, in the beta band, we have some connection with the frontal regions that disappear with the SSPC approach. And in the gamma band, we have some more connection with the frontal regions, potentially because the handling, which is the frequencies at which potentially muscular artifacts are more prominent. And so, of course, we still have to see whether this is a good thing or bad thing. I think it's a good thing, because maybe before they were removed with the other procedure, but still, of course, a lot of work has to be done to see how exactly which is the best approach to have a procedure that is reliable. And lastly, I just wanted to show how different functional connectivity measure fares on the same dataset. And here is a SMA simulation at rest. And here you can see the components and the topographical distribution of activity over time. So we have of course, the activity under the stimulator that remains for a certain amount of time, that goes to central electrodes and then travels across different brain, or actually scalp regions. And we applied both phase measure that can be affected by value on conduction as phase locking value, and or the imaginary part of the phase locking value, and measure that shouldn't be so affected by value on conduction. And indeed, as you can see with the PLV, the strongest connection that we found were not actually reflecting at least the spread of signal that we could see, or a travel of signal that we could see at the scalp level, meaning that it was more linked to regions, posterior regions, and regions near the stimulation site. Whereas if we just take out the real part to the computation of the PLV, instead the amount of connection dramatically decreased. And that's also true for the imaginary coherence. Whereas with the WPLI, we have this set of frontal connection in both alpha and beta bands that were not addressable with the other metrics that are present in the spread of signal in the sensor space, but also in the effective connectivity. So in the sensor space, in the source space that we saw as a time course of the activation. We applied these functional connectivity metrics in some cases. So this is the first paper that we had on functional connectivity. And here we explored, if I have 10 minutes, 5 minutes. Yeah, 5 minutes, it's okay. In which we explored how the somatosensory regions responded to TMS pulse in different during different tasks, and in particular during the processing of a tactile event or the observation of a tactile event, to see if these the profile of response of the somatosensory regions could be linked to the mirror touch effect that usually is reported at the behavioral level. And indeed, what we found was a difference in the connectivity profile, especially in the alpha band and in the beta band, meaning that the observed touch elicited just a functional connectivity network in the beta band, whereas the real tactile event had the alpha and beta band connectivity profile. And the lack of alpha band connectivity, functional connectivity network has been related to subthreshold tactile stimulation. So what we propose is that alpha band functional connectivity of the somatosensory, starting from the somatosensory region, can be a prerequisite for access to awareness of the tactile event, and thus mirror touch events could be processed by somatosensory regions, but not directly accessible by awareness. So usually we don't feel touch when we see a touch on another person or another body part. However, there are, okay, yeah, I had also the explanation. So it is possible that observed touch are processed as subtracial stimuli. However, there are people that feel touched when they see another person being touched. And these are persons that have a condition which is called mirror touch synesthesia, which is not a pathological condition, but it is an experiential features of these subjects. And we tested the synesthetic participants, and indeed the alpha band connectivity pattern starting from S1 stimulation was greater in this participant compared to participants that did not have this condition. So it can be proposed. As you can see here, functional connectivity is in the sensor space. We were young and we were naive. We moved to somehow source space reconstruction. So to address whether actually the access to consciousness of the tactile event could be resonating with the functional connectivity network driven by S1 stimulation with TMS, we applied the same protocol with a rubber hand setting. So we modulated the sense of ownership of the other hand, so the observed hand, and of the personal hand. So by decreasing the personal hand ownership and increasing the ownership of the observed hand. And we performed the same task of, so not the same task, but the same stimulation procedures. So we stimulated S1 during the observation of a touch of an embodied hand or the feeling of a touch on the own hand. And indeed, what we found was the same pattern in the alpha and beta band, but in particular in the alpha band, in the visual touch condition, we have an increased set of connection between the S1 and the visual and frontotemporal areas, meaning that the sense of ownership of what we are observing being touched modulates the functional connectivity network of S1. And we also have the same data set I presented before on the effective connectivity part. We also had a functional connectivity profile, which was estimated. So here is the results I presented before concerning the spatial distribution of activity after the TMS pulse of the left SMA in the go-no-go task at early or late time windows. And here you have the functional connectivity in the alpha, beta, and low gamma band profiles. And as you can see, there are several differences, meaning that in the alpha band, as the action approaches, the connection with the occipital and more posterior regions increases because I have to pick up somehow signal from the visual regions, and this is also observable in the gamma band connections. Whereas in the beta band connections were stronger with regions that are as the right inferior frontal gyrus, which are linked instead to task maintenance and to inhibition of the motor acts. So in this sense, we can see that also the connectivity profile changes according the functional connectivity profile changes according to the state of the SMA that was stimulated. Just the last slide to go back to the first studies that we performed with effective connectivity during the TDCS experiments. We also are exploring the functional connectivity profile of the parietal regions with the other regions, and in the we have an increase in the gamma band and a decrease in the alpha band in the anodal TDCS condition, which can be linked to the increased activation of the functional networks and a decrease in the default mode networks. And it is nice that it is with frontal regions that are the ones where we saw the effective connectivity changes be more prominent. But we also saw some differences, especially in the gamma band, in the cathodal condition at rest, where we did not find any difference in the effective connectivity, meaning that indeed it can be that these are highlighting different facets of the spread of signal from the stimulated regions to other cortical regions. As for future directions, of course, we have to systematize all of this, and also we can see how a static versus a dynamic approach can affect this measure of connectivity, because we know that TEPs are the result of local and also network re-entrant activities elicited by TMS, and this has been shown at the functional level, at the structural level, sorry, by saying that if the structural connections are removed, also the later components are suppressed in the TEP profile. So meaning that these different time windows can show us different aspects of the induced activity, but also at the functional level. So for example, by stimulating patients with different neural pathologies, it has been seen that indeed the activity tends to be more simple, and as we saw before, more related to the first and very big component as compared to the simulation of normal or intact tissue. And of course, it has still to be seen how all of this can be applied into the clinical context, if it can be informative. And lastly, I want to thank all the people that collected, analyzed the data with me. So my group at University of Milano Bicocca, but also Giulia Mattavelli that now is in Pavia, and of course the groups with which we collaborate. And thank you all for your attention.
Thank you for extensive talk. I have two questions, one rough and one more subtle. You're working with the conjunction of TMS and TDCS. How do you deal with the TDCS artifact during TMS?
Okay, so as I said before, somehow we discarded it during some of the data set. So the problem with the TDCS is the offset mainly, so the starting and the ending of the stimulation. Of course, there was more 50 Hertz related artifacts, because there was a machine that was working, so the stimulator was working while delivering the stimulation. But apart from these two periods and this general noise which subtracted with the filtering, there was not so much of artifacts. So the biggest issue actually was the patch itself, because of course we had to remove the electrode, and it somehow affected also the neighboring electrodes. And interpolation is tricky, so because if you remove a lot of electrodes all in the same spots, it becomes very difficult to do that. So we use very small electrodes, and now of course there are HD approaches and ring electrodes that are combined with EEGs, which renders things much more easy. So that as I saw, activity was affected by noise in general, but not that much. So it was still recognizable TP's waveform, and that's it. So to answer the question, we handle it with filters mainly. And of course, we were not stimulating during the whole time window where we were applying the electrical currents. but just after 7 minutes from, so after some minutes after the start of the stimulation. This also because it is supposed that the neuromodulatory effects are kicking in after a certain amount of time.
I'm asking because we are playing with TDCS and then trying to reaching the electrical stimulation of trying to phase dependently hit the enhanced oscillation.
But with TACS does?
We were initially trying with OTDCS.
Okay.
But that was giving us some drifts and artifacts we could not amend online. So we switched TACS.
Because we have an extensive data set also on TACS that we are trying to finish to acquire, but it's difficult.
Yeah. So even when the stimulation is off, we have problems with the first, say, 10-20 seconds of data, which has no physical reason.
Well, that's just a wild guess. That may be also related to the participant feelings, because the start and the end of the stimulation of the electrical stimulation are the ones where usually participants report more feelings of itching, burning, or after the end of the stimulation they don't feel this anymore. So maybe they relax a little bit. I don't know. It's just a wild guess, but that's.
And the second question is, so as far as I can see, you use WPLI as a electric.
Yeah.
And can I ask you, the connection you're showing are just thresholded or they're out of statistical tests? Okay, so the last ones, so the ones that I showed for the case studies and the last SMA dataset are statistically thresholded. So what I showed before, what we do is we test against the null hypothesis, so against 0 with a permutation approach, and then we also compare it with the same connection that survive that are created with shuffling the phase in a surrogate dataset. The other ones were instead just thresholded. So it was the 20% most, the strongest connection, but that's because it was these were single subject data, whereas the last one is a group of subjects. My question comes, even the WPLI for some sensible reasons penalizes the small phase lags. Don't you think you're even underestimating the connectivity effects? Because TMS EEG it has a rather strong effects, and the phase delays are relatively small, actually. Yeah, that's potentially actually very true. What the reason behind this choice is to be maybe too conservative on the spurious side. I know that this can be misinformative also, but that's we wanted to have a very conservative approach, since one of the main, let's say, comments that one can do is, okay, you're inducing a very big activity, so that can also be driven by that. So that's the reason. Yes, we are conscious that we may be overcorrecting, but we, for now, prefer to do like this. And also other, for example, Professor Marzetti told us that maybe we were overthinking about correcting for ghost connections, but still
I don't know if it's the right approach, but we prefer to do that.
Until there is no established truth, it's better to be more conservative.
Yeah, that's it. True.
So, well, first of all, thanks for your presentation. I have a couple of curiosity about the approach to use TMS EEG experiment. So the first curiosity is that, as you said, the quality of the data also depends, and the difficulty to remove the TMS artifact depends on the intensity of the pulse. I was wondering also if it's can depend also on the number of pulses, because if you use a single pulse or a triple pulse or more, changes something, or there are some approaches that are not recommended in a TMS EEG experiment. Also because with a single pulse, maybe you don't have enough power to activate an area, and so to also investigate the functional connectivity with other area. So you need more pulses. But the negative things is that you have more artifacts. So I was wondering if there is some limits or.
So, starting from the first questions about intensity, actually there is no consensus on how to calibrate the TMS intensity in TMS EEG and in TMS in general. Several studies uses the resting motor threshold, and this is acceptable if you stimulate M1. What has been proposed, and up to me, is the more reasonable, and I think Silvia will show it afterwards, approach for calibrating the intensity is to stimulate at an intensity where you have an activation of the cortex you are stimulating. That is not say that it is the resting motor threshold. For example, if you move from M1 to more parietal size, the distance from the scalp increases, and so also the electrical field that you induce over the cortex is dramatically different. So, of course, the problem with changing the intensity is linked to the fact that maybe you are not activating the cortex at all. On the other side, there are also peripheral reasons. So if you increase too much the intensity, you have also the activation of muscles over the head, or the activation of muscles at the periphery if you are stimulating M1, and so you have also the sensory component. So up to me, what Silvia and Mario Rosanova are trying to suggest everybody is the most appropriate. So we usually calibrate the intensity by looking at the online evoked TMS potentials, and there should be a reasonable intensity in the evoked responses that is elicited by the stimulation. But we can do it because we have the Next team that did it, and now everybody can do it, right? Also with several other EEG, not just the brain amp, but also other EEG amplifiers. So to see online the response in a pilot, let's say, stimulation set recording, and then apply stimulation during the experiment at that intensity. On the other, about the other question, I'm not sure if you are meaning that multiple pulses in the same trial. Okay, this is very rarely performed. Actually, I think there is just a couple of studies that did in a repetitive way. There are more studies about the pair pulse protocols. So, but these are used to induce GABAergic interactions to see how intracortical inhibition or excitation are, let's say, present in the cortex. So if you are specifically interested in that, of course, applying the pair pulse protocol is the way to go. Regarding the multiple pulses, usually what is performed in TMS experiment is that you perform 1 pulse per trial and that you use. Because of course, if you have more pulses, that has been shown to induce a rhythmic response in the EEG spatial-temporal profile. But one side is that if you want to have a rhythmic induced profile, or the other, or if you just want to activate more a region, maybe it's not the approach to use. I don't know if you have other takes on this.
Yes. So basically, when you apply grains of pulses, you're not really interested in the brain activity immediately after the train of pulses. You're trying to induce a plasticity effect.
Mm-hmm.
But I have the data sets, and I will look into them. I will give you a more informed answer in some weeks.
Perfect.
And also, I have the last curiosity. Can you also use like a shock condition?
No.
Okay.
That's the short answer.
No, because I was
We-
wondering if there are different ways to do shock condition. So, like when it is that you can stimulate an area that is not relevant for your experiment, but
Yeah, that's actually not really a sham condition, but it's an active control condition that we perform. So, for example, in the SMA, in the go-no-go task, we perform the same experiment on the visual cortex. So, same experiment, but stimulating it. So we had an active control condition. What we do, so by sham, meaning that we don't have, or so we have, but we don't have a sham coil, for example. What we do is having trials which are just behavioral. So we have the ERPs without the TMS induced activity that can potentially control for external effects that are not driven by the TMS. But we don't have, for example, sham condition with sound and with scalp stimulation with electrical electrodes to simulate the TMS discharge. Yeah.
What time is now? I think we can take a break. We can move to the other room where we can have some coffee, and then we will be back in half an hour. Yeah, or 20 minutes. Yeah.
So, everything is okay?
We can now start with the
Okay.
last talking with Professor Casarotto, which will be talking about the toolbox that allows to the RT toolbox that allows to check in real time the quality of the recorded EEG data after a TMS simulation and.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here to this event. And well, I will start with some slides showing practical issues that you can encounter while running TMS-EEG experiments. And if we have time, as the last part of my talk, I will show you a short video that has been recently recorded during a TMS-EEG workshop that my research group has organized in Milan at the end of September. Now, starting from TMS, we have to be aware of the mechanism that is behind this technique. So with transcranial magnetic stimulation, we are actually exploiting the electromagnetic induction principle. That is, we have an impulsive current flowing in a coil that generates an orthogonal magnetic field
which is impulsive as the current that generated it. And this impulsive magnetic field is able to induce an electric field in any conductor close to the coil. And this is the way we usually visualize the spatial distribution of the induced electric field in the cortex when we use a neuronavigation system. TMS, as this morning Paolo said, was initially applied alone, or better, in combination with peripheral measurement of muscular activity. The main effect of TMS on cortical neurons is thought to occur in correspondence to axonal bending. And it has been demonstrated in animal studies that actually TMS pulses can generate action potentials in cortical neurons. This is true, has been shown in monkey and rodent studies. Recently, it has been shown that TMS pulses in animal models, again, are able also to activate the dendritic tree. And this has been measured in this very nice study in rodents. Also, modeling studies have shown that depending also on the direction of the induced electric field, this is a model of a single pyramidal neuron, you can have first the activation of the axon and axonal branches, and afterward, over time, you have the activation of the soma of the neuron, and last, the activation also of the dendritic tree. And this pattern of activation is affected by the induction of the direction of the induced electric field. From our perspective, since we are interested in measuring the overall brain's reaction to single TMS pulses, we can imagine that with a single TMS pulse, we are actually activating locally cortical neurons under the coil, and then this activation, which is prevalent over the axonal bending, this activation is spread transsynaptically both to other cortical areas through a cortical-cortical connection, but also to subcortical structures such as thalamus and basal ganglia. We cannot demonstrate it unless we record invasively brain activity from all these structures simultaneously with TMS. But there are modeling studies that support this view. So when you stimulate cortical neurons, you are locally activating these neurons, and this local activation spreads towards distant sites thanks to cortical-cortical, but also cortical, subcortical-cortical connections. Now, the EEG part. With EEG, we measure non-invasively from the scalp postsynaptic potentials of pyramidal cortical neurons that sum up their activity both in time and space. The EEG technique dates back to the first 20s, 30s of the 20th century. But actually, the combination of TMS and EEG is more recent, and this is the first study in 1989 in which the brain response to TMS pulses was recorded. However, as you can see here, in this experimental setting, the TMS coil was applied over one side of the brain,
and the response was actually recorded from the other side of the brain, so from the contralateral hemisphere. Why this strange setup? We are not recording, in this case, the local response of the brain, which should be expected as the largest one because it's close to the stimulation site. Well, because of technical issues, the TMS and EEG instrumentation interfere with each other, and the TMS may produce huge artifacts on the EEG signal, and that's why, by keeping them far away, it was actually possible, even at this time, to record the EEG response to TMS, but they had to go on the other side of the brain to collect clean signals. More recently, the first fully TMS-compatible EEG amplifier that was developed was able actually to overcome the problem of interference between TMS and EEG instrumentation. Indeed, if you look at the signal recorded by a conventional EEG amplifier close to the stimulation site, you see that right after the TMS pulse, there is a long-lasting period of several seconds during which the amplifier saturates, so is unable to record any signal. After a few seconds, the recording resumes, but clearly we are too far in time from the stimulation pulse to be able to see the actual immediate EEG response to TMS. The group led by Risto Ilmoniemi in Finland was the first who developed a special device, a special EEG, that allowed to gate the TMS pulse artifact. Essentially, the TMS device was able to send a trigger to the EEG amplifier 100 microseconds before actual pulse delivery, such that the EEG amplifier could simply wait until the pulse artifact was over. And so basically the EEG amplifier kept the last voltage that was measured at minus 100 microseconds before the pulse and kept it into the circuit until 2 milliseconds were passed after the TMS pulse, and then the recording resumed. In this way, and this is the same amplifier that Alberto was mentioning before, in this way we can have a clean EEG signal without any pulse artifact, starting as early as 2 milliseconds after the pulse. However, this equipment, which was quite bulky, and well, anyway, also for financial strategies by the company that used to produce the system, this system is not available on the market anymore. So other systems have used different strategies to deal with the pulse artifact. However, once you can get rid of the pulse artifact, you can record nice oscillations evoked by TMS after the pulse, as early as a few milliseconds after the pulse. When talking about TMS and EEG, actually, we not mentioning some other aspects of the whole experimental setting that are anyway crucial to run a successful experiment. Okay, TMS is fine, EEG is fine, but also another very critical component of the whole setting is the neuronavigation system. Why it is so important to be able to navigate in a proper way during a TMS-EEG experiment? Well, first because the effectiveness of a TMS, that is the way the induced electric field is distributed on the cortex, depends on the relative orientation between the induced electric field and the cortical gyri. So in principle, the largest effectiveness is reached when the direction of the induced electric field is orthogonal locally to the cortical gyrus to be stimulated. And you can see here that if we stimulate exactly the same spot on the cortex by rotating 90 degrees the coil orientation, you see color-coded a very different spatial distribution of the induced electric field. So clearly knowing which is the orientation we are stimulating the cortex is important to be able to choose the desired stimulation parameters and to ascertain the effects of these stimulation parameters on the response. Clearly, the fact that here we have a single very small dot, which is called the stimulation hotspot, is just a fake, so to say, display of the actual reality, because, you know, in reality, we are stimulating a quite large patch of cortex in both cases, yellow and reddish colors, around the spot. So when we say we stimulated these spatial coordinates in MNI spatial reference, actually we are stimulating a patch of cortex that can be as large as 1 centimeter square around it. Why to navigate? Well, because, as I showed you before, it is useful because we can select carefully the site of stimulation, the intensity of stimulation, the angle, and also the tilting of the coil on the scalp. If the stimulation coil is tangential to the scalp, we have the maximum TMS effectiveness on the cortex. But also because if we have a neuronavigation software, we can also digitize the electrode positions on the scalp. And this can be useful if we want to perform source modeling of our data. But most importantly, navigation is compulsory for longitudinal assessments. Imagine that you want to test how brain response changes before and after treatment, before and after performing a task, whatever. You have to be able to accurately reproduce exactly the same stimulation parameters in both experimental sessions. Otherwise, if you see a difference, you cannot say that the difference is due to the task or drug or treatment, or to the change, uncontrolled change of stimulation parameters. And also, I would say that during an experimental session, which can last 10-15 minutes, if we want to collect 200-300 pulses, say at 2-3 seconds interpulse interval, we have to be able to keep the same stimulation parameters within the experimental session. And if you have experience with TMS, you all know that the coil is quite heavy. So holding the coil manually can be quite an exercise, a physical exercise. And if you have not a navigation software that tells you where you are on the subject's head with the coil, it's easy to move a few millimeters apart or to rotate the coil without even realizing that you are moving, unless the navigation software tells you this information. And most importantly, and in the lab where I work, we deal often with patients who have cortical structural lesions. Without a navigation system, we cannot say whether we are stimulating over a portion of structurally preserved cortical tissue or we are stimulating over a clear lesion where we have massive neuronal death. So in this case, we do not expect any response to TMS. So for example, here you see a patient Thank you. Yes, Nasconti. Thanks. Great. Here you see a patient in which the left hemisphere is severely damaged, and this is clear by looking at the lack of contrast between gray and white matter over the T1 weighted MRI, but also it's clear from hypometabolism as revealed by PET neuroimaging. And you see that in this patient, the left hemisphere has this extensive damage. And if we stimulate over this hemisphere, we don't get any significant post-stimulus response to TMS. Conversely, if we stimulate the other hemisphere, which is structurally more preserved and also metabolism seems preserved, we can get an abnormal, because it's a brain injured patient, but still we have a significant oscillation evoked by TMS, so something that can be measured. Another important add-on to the TMS EEG experimental setting, in addition to the neuronavigation system, is a tool for masking the click sound produced by TMS. So in our lab, there are several methods that can be applied to effectively mask this click. The problem clearly is that at each TMS pulse, we have this noise that produces an auditory response, which is superimposed non-linearly, linearly, we don't know precisely, to the genuine active response to direct cortical activation by TMS. In our lab, we have developed this software tool, which is called the TAC. And well, it simply allows you to record the sound produced by your TMS coil. And different TMS units can produce different coil clicks. Then you can mix within the software a version of the noise of your TMS coil with a white noise. This tool has several parameters that can be set, and if you have a collaborative subject, you can interact with the subject and ask him whether the coil click is still perceivable or not, and you can fine-tune these parameters. And this can be helpful to keep the loudness of the noise masking volume not very high, but still being able to mask the click. If we don't mask the click, we can have these slow N100, P200 components that have been already shown before, and they can sum up either linearly or non-linearly to our genuine EEG responses to TMS, direct cortical activation by TMS. We can check before there were some questions about do you use sham stimulation or not? Well, it depends, because if you want to run a sham stimulation session, it takes time, so the duration of your experiment in theory doubles. So you may not have this amount of time for all subjects and patients that you want to collect. Usually, if you have a collaborative subject, you can rely on his or her report about still hearing or not the TMS click. And if you have doubts, you can apply only in that case a sham condition without and with the noise masking applied. As a sham condition, I mean simply tilting the coil on the head with 90 degrees. In that way, you can still hear the click, but you are not effective on the cortex anymore. So you can compare the two conditions and see whether you have masked the possible presence of auditory potentials. I would say the last tool that you need to perform a TMS-EEG experiment, in addition to neuronavigation, noise masking, is the possibility to visualize in real time EEG responses to TMS. This is also useful because you have a tool to verify that these conditions are met, so that also your auditory potential is gone when you apply noise masking. But clearly this tool has been designed specifically for looking at the EEG responses to TMS. And using this tool, you can evaluate the quality of the data already during data collection. So if something is going wrong, you can still have time to adjust the stimulation parameters and your experimental strategies before collecting the data. I have reported here 3 works showing the software for real-time monitoring of TEP quality, for the masking of auditory evoked potentials, and a recent review study about the neuronavigation. So in these works, you can see better explained what I summarized just a few minutes ago. Now, we can say that if a TMS-EEG experiment is performed using appropriate strategies, EEG responses to TMS can be demonstrated to be reproducible over time, as well as sensitive to stimulation parameters, that is, specific to stimulation parameters. And some years ago, we have conducted a systematic study in which we developed a method that now I'm skipping for the sake of time. With this method, we were able to compare pairs of TMS evoked potentials and to extract a synthetic measure of how much different these 2 TMS evoked potentials were over time and space. By applying this measure of difference, of divergence between pairs of TMS evoked potentials, we compared the TEPs recorded using the same stimulation parameters, hours or days apart in 2 different experimental sessions, to check whether they were not too much different. And also, we compared the pairs of TMS evoked potentials recorded by changing the stimulation site, intensity, and angle, to search for systematic difference between these. And indeed, eyeball, here I have reported an example of 2 TMS evoked potentials, one in red, one in blue, recorded with exactly the same stimulation parameters accurately controlled for by using a navigation software, but recorded 1 week apart in the same healthy subject. So you see that the waveforms are very reproducible across sessions. Conversely, if in the same experimental session, same subject, we stimulated, the response we obtain are very different. Similar thing occurs when we apply the TMS to the same cortical site, same angle, but different intensity. Or we keep the same intensity, same spot, but we change the angle of stimulation. Overall, if you imagine that here on the x-axis you have a measure of the difference between pairs of TMS evoked potentials, you see that the largest differences have been observed when changing the site of stimulation, the intensity of stimulation, while by changing the angle of stimulation, we had a number of sessions with a significant difference and a few sessions with negligible differences. Clearly, the angle of the induced electric field is the parameter that we can control less with TMS, because the actual effect of TMS, if it is specific for the axons, it depends on how well these axons are spatially organized. So if you stimulate the motor cortex, where pyramidal neurons with their axons are all parallel to each other, you can predict that a small change in the angle can affect greatly the response, can modify greatly the effectiveness of TMS. Conversely, if you stimulate cortical regions in which the spatial displacement of neuronal axons is more random, you may find smaller differences in the effectiveness of TMS on the cortex. If we cumulate that measure of diversity, not over the entire post-stimulus period, but over specific time windows, say the first 60 milliseconds or between 60 and 120, 120 and 250 milliseconds, you see that the conditions C in which there was a change in stimulation parameters show significantly different values as compared to the no change comparisons, even at long latencies, showing that even the TMS evoked components occurring late in time, say after 200 milliseconds in time, keep a significant, measurable sensitivity to stimulation parameters, meaning that there is something genuine also in late components. Otherwise, we would see specific responses very similar to each other wherever we stimulate, at any intensity we stimulate. And again, as also shown in the previous talks, when you stimulate different cortical modules, you elicit responses that are different and may reflect some intrinsic properties of cortical neurons of that area. So, for example, when you stimulate the occipital cortex, you get a large response, normally in healthy awake subjects, with an oscillation, with the oscillation frequency around 10 hertz in the alpha range, let's say. If you move towards the parietal cortex, you get a smaller response with oscillations mainly in the beta range. When you move frontally, you get a smaller, even smaller response with a frequency of oscillations in the gamma range. And again here, you can see that over time, if you plot the distribution of voltages corresponding to different responses obtained by stimulating different cortical sites, you see that each response has a high temporal and spatial specificity, because at each point in time, the traces are different when you stimulate different cortical sites, both in the temporal domain and also, say, in the spatial topographical domain. As also shown before by Alberto and Paolo, when we apply the same TMS parameters in the same subject in different conditions, say wakefulness and deep sleep, we obtain different EEG responses that reflect the status of cortical circuits. And in particular, we in our lab, we are interested in this finding the neural correlates of consciousness. So we like comparing between these very different conditions like wakefulness, deep sleep, anesthesia. And we have developed a specific measure, synthetic one, to quantify the complexity of EEG response to TMS, to see whether this number can differentiate between wakefulness or conscious conditions versus unconscious conditions. And this measure is called PCI, Perturbational Complexity Index. It measures the spatiotemporal complexity of the deterministic pattern of EEG activation significantly evoked by TMS. And indeed, this measure works quite well, so it can separate between conscious and unconscious conditions. But what I want to focus here is that we have been able recently to reproduce these results that were obtained in our lab by teaching other labs how to run TMS-EEG experiments. So by sharing common experimental procedures, which can be good but still not perfect, they can be further improved. But if we agree on the same standard experimental procedure, and both on the data collection part and also on the data analysis part, so we share the same pipeline, which again can be good but not perfect, it can be certainly improved, we can get reproducible results across laboratories. And I think that this is, say, the way that we should start running. And, data sharing code for the analysis pipeline and strategies, and simulated data sets with genuine EEG responses plus known artifacts. I think it's the way to test the procedures, to further improve them, and to get to the point of having a technique that not only in theory is very useful and has potentially a lot of applications, but also in practice is easier to apply and more reliable. Indeed, we have this very powerful tool that allows us to measure cortical reactivity virtually of any cortical site, but this tool entails several challenges. First of all, when we start a new experimental session, we have to choose among a huge number of stimulation parameters. We have to decide where to stimulate, at what intensity, and with which 3D angle rotation of the coil. Despite the use of a sophisticated neuronavigation system and neuroimaging recorded in the subject, anyway, our a priori biophysical and anatomical knowledge is insufficient to predict the impact of TMS on cortical neurons. And as already mentioned, the electrical interference between TMS and the EEG amplifier produces electromagnetic artifacts, but also biological confounds related to coil vibration, the sensation of coil vibration, muscle twitches, and auditory artifacts, and so on. But let's go back to what we would expect from such a technique. If we imagine to stimulate a cortical area, we would expect to elicit a local activation that progressively spreads towards distant sites according to functional as well as anatomical connections. So, if we can look in real time at the EEG response to TMS, we can evaluate whether this is the case or not, whether what we see on the screen reflects our prediction. And indeed, this is not a novel approach because it's the usual approach applied in clinics, for example, when collecting ultrasound data. So the ultrasound operator simply put the ultrasound probe on the body of the patient and moves it manually, randomly, seems like, until the operator sees on the screen something that is meaningful to him. And at that point, freezes the screen and takes some relevant measurements, and we trust the ultrasound operator doing this work. But even in the TMS EEG field, we can say that this approach is not novel, because even when recording motor evoked potentials, what we usually do is to put the coil on the scalp, then we deliver a pulse, we look on the screen whether there is an EMG response, and if not, we adjust the stimulation intensity, but also position and of the coil and orientation until we get a desired activation on the screen recorded from peripheral muscle. So we propose to do the same with EEG, and clearly to do this we need a dedicated software tool because of the main issues related to electrical interference between TMS and EEG that we've seen before. If we go back to this very first TMS EEG study, let's say, and we zoom in part of the text, it says this thing. During delivery of stimuli, the coil, this is MC is the coil was progressively tilted towards the horizontal until a response was elicited, and then carefully rotated to yield minimal stimulation artifact. Additional stimuli were then delivered at surrounding sites at approximately 1 centimeter intervals until an optimal response was recorded from contralateral homologous scalp. So all this approach, this is what we do in our lab, and I will show you now the video, was already in this paper, precisely. Now, the customized software tool that we have developed in our lab to inspect TMS EEG data in real time has essentially two features. One is the single trial display, and the other is the average display. Concerning the single trial display, it's useful because it allows you to spot large artifacts which have a distinctive time course on the screen. Average TMS evoked potentials, well, it's useful to inspect them because say that you deliver 20 trials and you look at the average of these trials, you can already get a coarse idea of the signal to noise ratio of your data, and also you can check for the possible occurrence of spurious artifacts that have lower amplitude but are time locked to TMS, so they can appear after averaging, such as auditory evoked potentials. This is how the software appears, and it's actually compatible with different EEG amplifiers by different producers. This is the experimental setting that we use. So we have the subject that is stimulated with TMS, is connected to an EEG amplifier, and then there is usually an intermediate box that collects both EEG data and a trigger from TMS and sends everything to an EEG, to a computer for EEG recording. So the data are recorded by this computer using the proprietary software of the EEG amplifier. At the same time, while they are stored on the hard disk, raw data as they are collected, the same data are sent via Ethernet connection to another computer, an additional one, which runs this MATLAB-based graphic user interface. In principle, you can do both things into one computer. I usually prefer to have an additional computer, although it makes a bit more complicated the experimental setting, just because I don't want, for any reason, that the computer that collects the data crashes and so we are losing data. That's why I keep them separate. But in principle, you can run on the same computer. So with this setting, let's start a new measurement session. If we deliver a single pulse, what do we see on the screen? We use, in this case, the single trial mode display. Well, because of the presence of the pulse artifact, we don't see any signal on the screen apparently, because this artifact is spread everywhere, is huge compared to EEG activity, and it is produced by the fact that there is a transient current flow in the coil with a current peak of several kiloamps. Fortunately, this artifact, which is really huge, can be short if the electrode shape is correct and if the hardware characteristics of the amplifier are set in a proper way. We can have electrodes of different types, so pellet-wise, wire-wise, or ring-wise with a slit. The slit is very important. And the EEG amplifier should have a wide measuring range. Several tens of millivolts are recommended. A large hardware filtering bandwidth, up to several kilohertz, and a high sampling rate. Usually several kilohertz, at least 5 is recommended. If we have this type of EEG amplifier, well, we can say that the TMS pulse artifact lasts only a few, less than 5 milliseconds. So in the software, the real-time software, we can simply replace this artifact by a flat line, so to mask it. And in this case, we can adjust the y-axis range to be able to see the signal under the artifact. The artifact is only apparently gone in the visual interface. It is still present in the raw data recorded. So, as a first pre-processing step, before any filtering, any downsampling, whatever, you have to remove this artifact in a better way than replacing it with a flat line. So interpolation, we take a piece of baseline, for example, and we replace the artifact by this, using this piece of baseline, but there are several strategies that can be used. Okay, so we have masked the pulse artifact on the software. We deliver a single pulse, and what do we see on the screen? We may see a strange artifact with a strange waveform, smaller compared to the pulse artifact, but still quite big compared to EEG. It spreads everywhere and has a strange, weird waveform. It is the recharge artifact. This artifact is produced by the fact that the stimulator's capacitors need to be recharged between subsequent pulses. So in case there is a transient current flow, small current flow, or even only a change in the potential of the coil during the recharging, this artifact occurs in the EEG. So it really depends on the characteristics of the stimulator. However, a very simple way to get rid of this artifact is to manually set the time of occurrence of the stimulator's capacitors recharging far from the time point at which the pulse is delivered. This is the easiest solution, and I would say that almost all the TMS units nowadays allow you to set the recharge artifact at a desired point in time. So in this way, you can have a clean window post-TMS, say of 900, 1000 milliseconds as you want after the TMS pulse. Okay, so we have masked the pulse artifact, delayed the recharge artifact, we deliver a single pulse, and what do we see on the screen? Sometimes we may still see an artifact which is much smaller compared to the previous ones. It is characterized by a sharp deviation from baseline, followed by a slow return to baseline that can last several tenths of milliseconds. It can be annoying because it is usually located close to the stimulation site. It is the discharge artifact. This artifact is produced by the fact that TMS pulses may charge all the capacitances that are found close to the stimulation site. So if at the electrode gel or gel skin interface the impedance is not low enough, you may get a capacitance effect. So these charges, after being charged by the pulse, these capacitances discharge and produce the sort of decaying artifact. The solution is to well prepare the skin before running the experiment. And clearly also the shape of EEG electrodes can be such to facilitate skin preparation. So what we usually do is well, I can do this and this. Okay. We can move the hair away around the electrode until we expose the skin. Then we put a bit of abrasive paste. We scratch the skin to remove the outmost part of the skin. And then we add a little bit of gel just in the electrode hole to make the good contact. This procedure is quite simple but effective. And when you run a TMS EEG experiment, don't give for granted also the consumable materials that you have in your lab. Try different ones, try different gels, different abrasive paste, different tips. And so find your way to make good impedances. And there are several materials that are good, others that are less good. It depends on their viscosity, depends whether they contain metallic components. So sometimes even just changing the gel helps a lot in improving data quality. So try different solutions and keep the best one. Okay, now we did everything in the right way. We deliver a single pulse, and then we look at the EEG on the screen. What do we see? Well, at this point, it's very important to be able to see in real time single trial EEG responses to TMS. Why? Because if we are blind at this stage, we deliver hundreds of pulses, then we go home the day after we analyze the data, and we find something like this, a huge muscle artifact superimposed to our data. At this point, there is not much to do unless to apply sophisticated methods to reduce this artifact. Conversely, if we can see the single trial response, as shown here, you immediately spot the presence of a muscle artifact. Why? Because it can have quite a large amplitude, but it has a characteristic waveform with a biphasic shape followed by a slow return to baseline. Also, it is located on the most lateral aspects of the head on the side of stimulation. Muscle artifact is produced by the direct activation of the nerve terminals on the skull muscles. Skull muscle twitches produce electric artifacts that are recorded on the EEG, but also they can be perceived by the subject, so potentially produce unspecific brain responses to sensory stimulation and can also be bothering for the subject. So the solution is, in this case, to, if possible, maximally prevent their occurrence by adjusting stimulation parameters. Clearly, this means that we cannot stimulate cortical regions that are too lateral on the head. This is a limitation of this approach. But if you are interested in a region close to midline, this is, I think, the most affordable solution to get clean data. And indeed, we can say that, and I will show you later a video, that if you just have a muscle artifact and you rotate a bit the coil, say by 30 degrees, you may completely get rid of it and get clean data. Another very important thing that should be considered is that after having a clean single trial response, now we can look at the average response. It's very important because also if we are blind at this stage, we may collect hundreds of trials, then we go home, the experiment is over, and the day after, we get something like this. So no significant EEG activation after the TMS pulse compared to baseline. This means that TMS was not effectively stimulating the cortex. But if I look at the EEG response in real time, I immediately realize whether I'm in this problematic situation or not. However, when looking at average response, it's very important to consider the reference issue. So usually we call skull potentials, but actually they are skull potential differences between measuring electrodes and a physical reference electrode located somewhere, forehead, linked earlobe, mastoids, wherever. And the signal also reflects the signal present in the reference. So if we look at taps in common reference, this is just a zoom of this area, we can see that the signal is very much correlated across channels. So the solution to get rid of this, say, common mode signal is to apply average re-referencing. And this is useful. But if we apply average re-referencing, considering in the computation of average reference all channels, including the bad ones, such as this very bad channel, you see immediately that this large artifact spreads everywhere after average re-referencing. And also, I don't know if you noticed that this channel was flat for some reason, was not in good contact with the skin. But if we apply average reference to all channels, we are putting some signal in this channel, which is fake, is not true. So the solution is to apply average re-referencing by considering good channels only. And this can be performed in real time in the visualization software. Clearly, it's very easy to do this offline when you run your analysis, and you always do this. But in real time, this was a feature that was not present in any commercial software sold together with a TMS compatible EEG amplifier. So that's why it was necessary to develop a customized display. So if we do this, you can immediately see that EEG responses to TMS are larger close to the stimulation site compared to distant channels. They are larger early in time, say in the first 50 milliseconds compared to later latencies. And also, they show an asymmetric amplitude, which is coherent with the stimulation side. So if you stimulate on the left, you will have larger responses over left channels compared to homologous right channels. And if you get this signal after 20 trials, well, after 100 trials, 200 trials averaging, it can just be better. So better signal to noise, but you see that between the blue and red curve, they are very, very similar. Now, I want to skip this part because we have time. This was like a slide version of the video that I like to show you. Okay. In this video, I will show you a part of a live demo session with TMS EEG that we recently ran in Milan together with my colleagues. So this is Mario Rosanova, just to mention a few, the ones that you will see here. Simone Sarasso, Giulia Furregoni, she's an undergraduate student in our lab, and this is Gabriel Hassan, PhD student in our lab, who is the subject in this video. So here you will see the experimental setup with the EEG here, the neuronavigation software, the camera for the neuronavigation, and Mario's holding the coil. And here on the right, you will see in real time the EEG responses to TMS. In this case, we want to find a new stimulation spot over the left motor cortex. Actually, for the sake of time, we were not putting EMG electrode on Gabriel's hand. So we were just looking at the twitch, whether we were actually stimulating the motor cortex or not. And then we set stimulation intensity below the threshold for eliciting a twitch. But I'll let you see this, and I hope that also
take off the location control, because now we are searching for a new spot. We don't have prior and stimulation parameters set. So Mario likes if you zoom over the cortex. And then we can start per second the maximum stimulated output. Sure, it is well above estimate threshold of Gabriel. So since now we are not very specific, because we are not putting, for the sake of time, EMG electrodes over specific muscles, so we just search for a twitch and say okay, it's motor. And we will adjust the stimulation intensity accordingly. So now you're searching for a spot over the cortex, the arrows are black, so is tangential to the skull. Okay, here we have the C2 channel, which is quite red with a lot of black noise. And Gabriel is twitching. Okay, it's already twitched. So you want me to reduce stimulation intensity. Okay, so let's do, I don't know, 45 for simplicity. Is he twitching?
you see that each time Mario delivers a single pulse, you see a single trial EEG response to TMS on the screen.
So you see that channel now has a lot of light noise. Yes, now we have averaged 4 trials, so already you see that this light noise goes everywhere, right? But we can, for example, remove this channel from the computation of the average reference, the signal becomes clearer. And this was just to show the average reference issue. Okay.
So we have both the problems we were expecting. We have the twitching. We are, of course, underestimating the motor threshold, overestimating. I always get confused in this. Anyway, we do not have the EMG, so we are only basing our judgment on the twitch. And second, we have a very large scalp muscle. It's biphasic, as Silvia was showing in the talk.
You see the waveform is biphasic, down, up, and then you have a slow return to baseline.
All right, so we have a response. So there is an asymmetrical response. Of course, we like it on one side. On the other hand, it is largely affected by your scalp muscle. It's not the tiny scalp muscle we saw before. It was not even close to the stimulation site. Under the coil, it's affecting the response for about yes, and here. So we have to is we have a response. We can do two things. Let's start using intensity stimulation. Then, after it's still there, we can rotate the coil to reduce also the scalp muscle.
Consider that each of these traces shows a piece of baseline plus a piece of the post-stimulus time. Usually we look at minus 100 plus 400 milliseconds. But it's a setting that the user can choose depending on the screen. If you have a large screen, you can do more or whatever.
For the last discussion, go at 40 instead of 40.
You see this virtual aiming device here. It is the neuronavigation software that tells you if you are green, it means that you were stimulating with the same stimulation parameters concerning stimulation site and angle as before, as the stimulation spot that you selected, the stimulation coordinates that you selected before. And here you play with the stimulation intensity.
But ask Daniel whether he feels something. Are you moving it? Just one time.
The twitch is not there anymore, or it's very unreliable. Again, that's not the optimal way to measure the body pressure. We should stick couple of electrodes on the garbage and skin and record the proper MP, variable potential. Then there is following the Rossini's rule or this kind of procedure, we can decide whether we are above, at, or below the threshold. So we are happy with the twitch. We are not happy at all with the scalp muscle. So what we can try to do is to rotate the coil and see at least if we can get a smaller scalp muscle. This, of course, is a try and error procedure. So we start rotating clockwise. We don't know how these fibers are oriented. Okay? For instance, it would be nice to have one day MRI also with the fiber orientation, scalp fiber orientation. We have to reduce the time to look for target on the scalp that is devoid of muscle activation. Okay, that's right. So keep the same spot and start rotating. Okay.
clear this average. I take the location control off, and you'll see from this virtual end device that hotspot will be the same, but the coil will be rotated. This is the single trial response. From this, there is no more the large muscle artifact that was present before. So we can keep this stimulation spot, fix the location control, average a few trials, and see whether we reduce the muscle artifact, but we still have a response. Because remember that over the motor cortex, axons are organized in a very specific way. They are parallel to each other, very well packed. So if you change the angle, you may get a very different response, either a lower or non-response, paradoxically, because they are all oriented in the same way. So either you activate them all or nothing. Okay, you can go.
Now we average a few trials on the same spot, the one without large muscle artifact.
Artifact much smaller, still present, a bit of the lateral electrodes, but we zoom here. We see that the response is there. It's not disappeared. The amplitude is still quite good, so over CP3 we have a peak to peak about 20 microvolts peak to peak in the first 50 milliseconds. So the latency of this negative peak is 49 milliseconds. And this response is larger on the left than on the right side, is larger close to the stimulation site as compared to other cortical areas, and larger in the first 50 to 80 milliseconds than later. So this peak is at 74 milliseconds, and the previous positive peak is at 32. So about 50 to 60 milliseconds inter-peak interval.
So we do not have time. We are on the right track to maybe even polish this calf muscle. We are not yet happy. We could rotate a bit more and get rid of this calf muscle and have a clean response to TMS. But this is just to give you a flavor of what is like searching for the good response. Doesn't take too much. In this case, it's a tricky area. The way it took like 5-10 minutes. But then, again, you go home and you can rely on what you recorded because you know what you recorded. You know that there was a tiny muscle. You did your best to reduce this muscle, then you were happy at some point with the result. You have a response that is large, with a good signal to noise ratio, with a good signal to noise ratio, and specific for the stimulation size. Okay, and that's it. So then you analyze your data, but from already a very good starting point. know already what we get involved like this, we can go further.
So now the Q&A. Starting again. No. Okay, so just I wanted to mention that this video is a brief portion of a larger video that will be uploaded shortly on the site of the Brain Products Academy. And we have other videos that can be useful. This is an older live demo session that was recorded in Charleston during the brain stimulation conference. So you can, this is another presentation very similar to the video recorded one, to the one I gave today, and you can find this both for free on this website. Thank you very much for your attention.
I was not using the microphone.
I have two questions actually. The first one is if you have tried to use these tools with stimulating areas that are not motor or premotor areas or frontal areas, and if it works well.
Yes, it works clearly. Well, if you stimulate close to the midline, we usually stimulate premotor, parietal, and occipital cortex. These are our targets. Close to the midline. So if you look at electrodes within F1, F2, C1, C2, P1, P2 lines. If you go more laterally, so if you stimulate in that area, you can almost get rid of muscle artifacts, almost for any subject. If you go more lateral, you cannot get rid of all muscle artifacts, but you can reduce it, as shown for motor cortex. So instead of having, 600 microvolts peak-to-peak muscle artifact, you have 80 microvolts, which is better for any post-processing approach you want to apply, either ICA or sound or artist. I mean, the less artifact, the better they work in any case.
This approach is, and maybe this toolbox specifically, is useful, at least theoretically, also when the stimulation is not an electromagnetic stimulation, but for example, if you stimulate like a visual stimulus, so you have a near and static basically.
Yes. Well, it anticipates a bit what you will get after data analysis. So instead of recording blindly, you can use it. For example, we were running some SEP experiments, and we were just, fine-tuning the graphic user interface. And sometimes I went in the lab and say, well, can I play with it? But we are recording SEP. Well, it's the same. I mean, it's evoke potential, just to see whether it was running correctly and picking the signal correctly or not. Yeah, you can use for other evoked potentials.
Can you also find how many trials? 20 is
well, 20 is, to take a decision fast. If you are doubt, you can keep on stimulating and decide to stop when you are happy, and then at that point you can start recording. 20 because usually when we have a clean response at the single trial level, we go for averaging. I can tell you that for premotor cortex, already after 10 trials, you already know, okay, there is a response, or no, we should change something. For a parietal response, we need sometimes even 30 to be sure, okay, it's a good response, or no, there is. So if there is nothing, you immediately see even after 10 trials. If there is something, but you are not sure whether the signal to noise is good enough, the amplitude, you want to measure it well, you may get more trials. You stop when you like, it's not a rule. And even, you know, what's the peak-to-peak amplitude of the early response you should be happy with after 20 trials? I don't know. So we say 10 microvolts, fine. But if you have a subject with a lot of skull muscles, and then after 15 minutes search, you found a good spot, but the amplitude is 8 microvolts. What do? You keep it. Maybe in that case, you average more trials, because you know that if you have a smaller response, you have to clean more the spontaneous EEG with more trials. Conversely, if you have a 15 microvolts peak-to-peak, you may average less trials. And also it depends on background EEG. For patients who have brain lesions and have a very slow EEG background, we may have to go and search for larger peak-to-peak amplitude to be able to have a signal-to-noise ratio that then allows you to analyze the data. So it really depends, and you can also simulate, you know, you can take your, we were thinking also about something like this. So you register, you record the 5 minutes of resting state EEG, as you usually do for any subject that pass from the lab. Then you can use the variability of that background EEG to set your desired peak-to-peak amplitude. So if you have a subject that even at eyes open is a bit tired and has a large alpha rhythm over posterior areas on that day, and so you may decide that you may simulate what would be your ideal peak-to-peak amplitude given that background. Or if you have a subject with a highly desynchronized EEG, you may need a smaller one. So it could be also computed, you know, in quasi-real time.
Thank you for your talk. I'm sure you will find my question. The question is that how about PCI applied to other disruptive brain diseases, not necessarily related to consciousness? So I'm sure you tried. How about PCI applied to some regions in case of stroke?
So, well, PCI per se is a measure of the complexity of the significant spatiotemporal activation evoked by TMS. So, in principle, you can apply it to any evoked signal. The thing is that it has been validated over a benchmark population. So, if you want to compare with that, with the cutoff, say, empirical cutoff between consciousness and unconsciousness, you have to do similar data, so similar data quality. You have to use TMS evoked potentials and not SEP. If you want to, you can compute PCI from SEP, for example, but then you cannot use the same threshold because it would be a different threshold, needs to be validated again. Concerning stroke, there is an issue related to the fact that we have a cortical region, for example, or subcortical region that is affected by stroke, but the rest of the brain is, say, intact. Clearly, it suffers from diaschisis from that area, so connection from the lesion area to elsewhere are broken, but the rest is structurally preserved. So you can stimulate different cortical spots and you obtain different PCI values. But what we found is that even when you stimulate the affected hemisphere, you may get a high complexity response overall, simply because this local activation spreads towards other sites that are preserved and functionally active. So you have recurrent activity that builds up complexity. But if you compute complexity locally, so you stimulate the affected hemisphere close to the lesion, and you compute PCI over a narrow eye of channels close by, you find a low complexity response. Whereas if you consider an narrow eye far away from the lesion, you find a high complexity response. So there is a local pattern that can be abnormal, but then when you consider the overall activity, you may get high complexity. So yeah, we tried, and it's clearly in that case, it's very interesting to see whether over time, during rehabilitation with the recovery of function, PCI renormalizes or not. Responders versus non-responders. Yeah. Oh, so over time is important.
Maybe I show this longitudinally in the affected region.
Yeah.
To the affected region.
And well, we have some evidences that there is a systematic increase of PCI in patients who recover from a stroke, functional recover from stroke. But we don't know what's the reason. So if it is a spontaneous recovery, or if it is related to physical therapy, to treatment. So we still are not able to influence the type of treatment that is delivered to patients. But it could be interesting, to compare between placebo, physical treatment, some kind of drug, depending on the case, and to find the mechanisms behind that kind of recovery. And why some patients, same therapy, recover and others don't. Thank you.